I was going to say the committee should come to order, but the committee's already in order. And we thank you for gathering with us today. I really want to thank Senator Heitkamp, who's en route, not from North Dakota, but she's I think, in the building. She'll be here momentarily. But she and Senator Chiesa, both new senators, actually recommended that we hold a hearing on this subject. I don't know if this is something coordinated or not. I know Senator Kelly has had enduring as a former AG, all three of them former AGs from their respective states, but strong interest in this issue, and they brought it to my attention, to the attention of Dr. Coburn, who's ranking Republican on the full committee. And we're very grateful to each of you for coming. We have a second panel, I think, that's going to follow you. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask, since Senator Chiesa is actually filling in for Dr. Coburn today, he moves from over there to right here. And Heidi Heitkamp, Senator Heitkamp is going to move from over there to right here. So we'll figure this all out. We'll get in our right seats and get on with the hearing. But human trafficking has been described as modern-day slavery. And that's because its victims are in some cases forced to work, including as prostitutes, sometimes in sweatshops, against their will. Trafficking victims may not be physically imprisoned, but they are trapped in often hellish conditions through physical or mental coercion that makes escape impossible, or at least to seem impossible. It's easy to think of human trafficking as something that happens somewhere else, in countries far away from ours that are suffering through war, maybe poverty. But sadly, human trafficking is a real and a growing problem all over the world, including right here at home. And it can be invisible unless officials and citizens alike are trained to recognize the telltale signs. By some measures, human trafficking is the second most significant criminal enterprise in the world, generating an estimate $32 billion in revenue. To me, that's stunning, and maybe to you as well. The statistics for one type of human trafficking, prostitution, are particularly shocking. I'm told that every year, more than 100,000 children in the United States are forced into prostitution. The average age of entry into prostitution is roughly 13 years of age. In fact, I understand that there have been reports of teenage girls forced to work as prostitutes by gangs and literally branded with tattoos to mark them as property. While the word trafficking sounds like a crime that involves moving people, the truth is that human trafficking doesn't necessarily involve victims smuggled in from other countries or even other states. Human traffickers prey on vulnerable people in our own communities. While some victims are undocumented immigrants, many are teenage runaways or other vulnerable individuals born and raised in the United States. Just last year in Wilmington, Delaware, a man was found guilty of forcing a 15-year-old girl to work for him as a prostitute. And just last month, the FBI conducted a 3-day operation in 76 cities that led to the rescue of 105 children who had been trafficked into the commercial sex trade. 2 of the children were found in the Philadelphia suburbs, roughly 25 miles from my home. This issue reminds me of a passage from the book of Matthew in the Bible. Some of you have heard it. In fact, I guess many of you have heard this. This is the least of these, the references to the least of these. But when Jesus was describing how God looked on those who perform acts of kindness for the disadvantaged by saying, "Inasmuch as you did it for the least of my brothers, you did it to me." And these vulnerable people are being preyed on by human traffickers are clearly the least of our brothers and sisters. And I believe that we have a moral responsibility to make sure that they are being protected. I am always looking to understand the underlying cause of things so that we are not just focusing on treating symptoms. We're pretty good at treating symptoms. We don't always go at the underlying causes. In the case of human trafficking, I'm hoping that our witnesses today can help us to better understand 3 key things. First, we need to know what drives human trafficking so that we can be more effective at stopping it. Second, we need to get better at identifying victims so that we can more successfully intervene and remove them from their terrible situations. And third and last, we need better identify potential victims of trafficking so that we can intervene before they're ensnared and offer them effective treatment or service before they fall prey. Today, we're fortunate to have 2 panels of witnesses who can help us understand the current efforts underway at the federal, state, and local and tribal level to attack human trafficking head-on. On our first panel, we have 4 senior witnesses from the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security who will speak on how the federal government has made human trafficking a priority for law enforcement and hopefully address some of the underlying causes. On our second panel, we have 4 witnesses who will speak on to how human trafficking impacts our communities and how state and local officials and even school children are tackling this problem. As I said just before Senator Heitkamp joined us, how much I appreciate both of them suggesting that we hold this hearing. Dr. Coburn is not going to be able to join us at the hearing, and Senator Chiesa has grudgingly agreed to sit here and sit in as the ranking member of the full committee. But we've been joined by Senator Ayotte, and it's interesting. I'm the only person here who's not a former AG. They're all recovering attorney generals. But it's probably not a coincidence that they're all here and they have an intense interest in this because of their roles as law enforcement officers. But we're delighted that you're here, and we're going to start off with our a friend from New Jersey who's sitting in for Dr. Coburn as the ranking member. And I'm going to ask if Senator Heitkamp would like to speak for a while, and to also offer that to Senator Ayotte if she'd be interested in saying anything. If you don't have to. If you'd like to, feel free. Okay. Senator Chiesa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you for your leadership of this committee, and thank you for your leadership on the issue of human trafficking. As the chairman said earlier, human trafficking should be called exactly what it is: modern-day slavery. It's a plague on our nation and the world. It is, to put it bluntly, a crime against humanity. It is a crime against the dignity of every person who is victimized by the ruthless criminals who trade in human beings. And it is a crime against society. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it is happening, not just in some foreign lands. It is happening here in our own country. And it's time, indeed it's past time, to put an end to it. We must not be content to just make a dent in human trafficking. We must do everything we can do to eliminate it, to abolish modern-day slavery from our country and from around the world. This is an ambitious goal, but not an impossible dream. We must commit ourselves to ending the nightmare that the millions of victims of human trafficking are living every day. Because none of us would give up our freedom for even a day, all of us must dedicate ourselves to ensuring that no one else suffers that fate. There are more people in slavery around the world today than at any other point in our history. As many as 27 million people around the world are being held in bondage, forced to work in unsafe, degrading, and inhumane conditions. That's the equivalent to 3 times the entire population of New Jersey, or 30 times the entire population of Delaware, and an estimated 100,000 of them are right here in the United States. Deprived of their liberty, subject to unspeakable abuse, the victims of human traffickers cry for help, but too often their cries are unheard. Today in this hearing, we are giving them a voice. We are hearing their pleas for rescue and for freedom. And most important, we are committing ourselves to answering their cries. The war to eradicate human trafficking must be fought on many fronts. It requires the concerted, sustained efforts of law enforcement, federal, state, and local. Intergovernmental cooperation is also essential to success. It requires legislators at every level to provide the resources that law enforcement needs to sustain an effective effort to bring human traffickers to justice. And it's not adequate to provide just enough resources to fund a limited effort. Without dedicated resources, there cannot be a dedicated effort. It requires lawmakers to make changes to the laws that allow human traffickers to sell their victims with impunity. Modern slaves are no longer auctioned in the public square. They are sold on the internet and on the back pages of newspapers. Human traffickers and the publishers who take their advertisements hide under the cloak of the First Amendment, even though the First Amendment was never intended to protect criminal enterprises. Eliminating human trafficking requires the active involvement of concerned citizens working together to raise awareness about this terrible problem and advocate change. Modern-day slavery exists in the shadows, but it leaves clues to its existence that informed citizens can recognize and call attention to. And it requires the close cooperation of federal, state, and local governments. We must work together to uncover the crime where it exists, prosecute the criminals to the fullest extent of the law, and assist the victims so they're not twice victimized, first by their captors, and then by the system that often treats the victims as criminals themselves. As an assistant U.S. attorney and as the Attorney General of New Jersey, I was in a position to ensure that we put in place the dedicated resources to sustain a dedicated effort to combat human trafficking. But I know that the vast majority of law enforcement agencies across the country and at every level find themselves limited in their efforts by the limitations of the resources. To our witnesses today, I ask you to be very candid in your assessment of where we stand in the fight against human trafficking and to tell us exactly what more we need to do to bring about its eradication. We have seen over the years effective short-term efforts to combat human trafficking in places where it seems to grow overnight and disperse just as quickly. International sporting events, such as the Super Bowl, which is being played in New Jersey this February, often attract huge numbers of human traffickers. And in New Jersey, we are seeing a coordinated effort to let human traffickers know that they are not welcome and that if they decide to bring their evil trade to our state, they will pay a heavy price. But as important as such efforts are, they are just part of the solution, and they are temporary in nature. For human traffickers, there is no off-season. And for their victims, there are no bye weeks or timeouts. Their captors exploit them day in and day out for as long as they can. Mr. Chairman, I'm very much looking forward to the testimony of our witnesses today. I want to again thank you for conducting this hearing today.
You bet. I want to thank you. We want to thank you and certainly Senator Heitkamp for suggesting that we do it and encouraging us in a very strong and forceful way. Senator Heitkamp, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chairman Carper, and I want to once again reiterate how much we appreciate the opportunity to bring this level of attention to a problem that I think way too often is in the shadows of our society. And I'm joined, I think, by no small coincidence with former AGs as we look at victimization, as we look at the challenges of providing services to victimization, providing effective enforcement of this kind of act. But we desperately need to take this problem out of the shadows. We need to identify what the causes are, as the chairman has said, but also what we can do to provide an effective deterrence, to make this our shock value of this problem. We need to have that shock value reflected in our prosecutorial system. We need to make this one of our highest priorities because, as the senator from New Jersey has said, this is in fact human slavery. There's no other way to I think, identify it. There's no other way to talk about it. And I think way too often we think about this problem as a matter of the sex trade. But yet we know it even goes beyond that. We're looking at trafficking in laborers, trafficking in domestic workers, and these are people who are not here as a result of a smuggle in, which is a completely different issue. They are here without any activity on their own. They are here because they are providing a source of revenue. They are being treated as a commodity, not a human being, and we are not that society. And so, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the testimony. I look forward to hearing not only what the problem is, but what the solutions are and how we can move forward in a very bipartisan way, as you see the panel up here today, to identify a path forward to prevent this horrible activity from occurring within our borders. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heitkamp, thank you, and again, thank you very, very much for your strong encouragement of me. Senator Ayotte, you're here. I know there's something you care about, and please, if you want to say a few words, feel free.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Chairman Carper. I want to thank Senator Chiesa and also Senator Heitkamp. We do share, having been former attorneys general, and I think seeing what an horrible crime this is of human trafficking in each of our states. I also want to point out, as Senator Chiesa has, that human trafficking is obviously an international problem and an international crime. And in fact, one of the problems with human trafficking is that it is used to fund terrorism around the world. So today we're going to be talking about domestic human trafficking, and it is absolutely horrific what happens to victims of human trafficking, and they are treated like things instead of people, and that is so wrong. So we need to do everything that we can to learn from you about how can we be more effective in allowing these vulnerable victims to come out of the shadows, to properly enforce the crimes and make sure that we have the right laws in place, and frankly send a message that from the federal governments and state governments working together, that we are not going to tolerate human trafficking in our country. and that we are going to make sure that victims are treated with dignity and respect, and that we prevent future victims from falling prey to such horrific crimes. And I will also say that we also know the act of trafficking itself is a horrible crime, but it often fuels other criminal activities. And so we would like to hear from you today, what other criminal activities are being fueled by human trafficking, and how do we make sure that we come down on those criminals as well, those types of activities that are actually encouraging more trafficking rather than making sure that we stop these types of crimes. So I thank all of our witnesses for being here, and most of all, I want to thank my colleagues for holding such an important hearing, and I look forward to working with all of you together on a bipartisan basis to address a problem that should not exist in the United States of America.
Senator, thank you. Thanks a whole lot for joining us today. And a lot of our colleagues are not here. We have no votes today, and so some may wander in during the course of the afternoon. But the folks that are here convening this hearing care deeply about this issue and want to make sure we address it. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of our witnesses on the first panel, and then later the second panel. But our first witness is Ms. Alice Hill, who I think was once a judge, was Superior Court judge in L.A.?
Yes, Los Angeles Superior Court.
All right. Should we call you judge? Do people still call you judge?
Occasionally they do, but I'll take Alice. I'll take anything. That's fine. Thank you.
I had one day last week when somebody called me congressman, somebody called me governor, somebody called me senator, and then I got a phone call from a kid. He's not a kid. He's 23. My son Ben, who calls me captain. He likes to call me Captain John. So, and I just say at ease, sailor, at ease. Our first witness is Ms. Alice Hill, senior counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security and chair of the Blue Campaign, which we'll be hearing about today. Before joining the department in 2009, Ms. Hill served as a Los Angeles Superior Court judge and as a federal prosecutor in the Los Angeles United States Attorney's Office. Before her career in public service, Ms. Hill was a lawyer in private practice in Paris, France. Our next witness is Jim. Do you go James or Jim?
Jim.
Jim Dinkins, Executive Associate Director of Homeland Security, Investigations for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE. As the Director, Mr. Dinkins has direct oversight of ICE's investigative and enforcement initiatives and operations. Prior to assuming his current position, Mr. Dinkins held a number of leadership positions within ICE, including Special Agent in charge for Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Mr. Dinkins began his law enforcement career with the U.S. Customs Service in 1986. Our third witness is Ms. Ann Gannon. She's currently the National Coordinator for Child Exploitation Prevention and Interdiction at the Department of Justice. Prior to holding this position, Ms. Gannon served as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Central District of California for 9 years, where she coordinated child exploitation investigations and prosecution. In 2009, she was named one of the top women litigators in California for her work combating child exploitation. Ms. Gannon began her career as a law clerk to U.S. District Court judge in Arizona. And who was that judge? Do you remember?
Yes, Judge Rainer Collins in Tucson.
All right. I don't know if that somebody rings a bell with our colleague here from Arizona or not, but he probably had something to do with that guy getting to be a judge. You know, you never know. Our final witness is Mr. Joseph Campbell, Deputy Assistant Director for the Criminal Investigation Division at the FBI. He's responsible for national-level leadership of complex financial crime, public corruption, civil rights, and criminal investigations. Mr. Campbell has held a variety of leadership positions within the FBI and began his career at the Bureau in 1990. It's my understanding that only Ms. Hill and Ms. Gannon will be providing oral statements for the panel, so we will begin with Ms. Hill and then move to Ms. Gannon. And as questions come along, gentlemen, you'll be invited to join in that, I'm sure. Before you speak, let me just say, a number of years ago, I think I was in the Senate, so it would have been the last 12 years. I was on an Amtrak train heading north to home, something I do almost every day, going back and forth. And I ran into one of my former colleagues from the House of Representatives. I believe it was John Miller, who I said to him, "What are you doing these days?" And he said, I think he said he worked at the State Department maybe, and I think his principal focus was human trafficking. Human trafficking. I don't know if it's someone that you've ever worked with or knew, but he said, pardon? There you go, human rights. But anyway, he said it's a big issue. This is a big issue, and he said even then that it's something I ought to think about and focus on as well. So I thought about it for a while. We're really delighted that you all are here. Your full testimony will be made part of the record, so feel free to summarize it as you wish. And I think at least one of you may have some video for us to see as well. Judge Hill.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Chiesa, and members of the committee. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, welcomes and appreciates the opportunity to speak with you today. The men and women of DHS are dedicated to combating the heinous crime of human trafficking. The Department's Blue Campaign coordinates and unites the Department's work. Before discussing specific initiatives of the Blue Campaign, I would like to show you a short public service announcement that illustrates what the senators have been speaking about, that human trafficking occurs in the United States and that there is a need for the public to open its eyes to trafficking victims hidden in plain sight. We'll play this now.
Every day we go about our lives driven by routine and blindfolded to the realities of the world around us. Our vision is clouded by the very normalcy we take for granted. Countless victims of human trafficking walk among us, seemingly invisible. Until now. The Blue Campaign provides a unified voice for those who oppose the heinous crime of human trafficking. Whether it's forced labor, domestic servitude, or the sex trade, it's time we open our eyes.
Sorry, I didn't even see it. No one ever does.
Learn what you can do to help by visiting dhs.gov/bluecampaign.
This is an example of our attempt to engage the public in a conversation about what is occurring here in the United States. As has been mentioned, traffickers use force, fraud, or coercion to lure their victims and force them into labor or commercial sexual exploitation. As Chairman Carper and Senator Heitkamp noted, it is important to distinguish trafficking from smuggling. The two are often confused, and certainly in our department, given our authorities, we want to make clear that there is a difference. Human trafficking is exploitation-based and does not require movement. Smuggling is movement-based across our borders illegally. I want to share with you the story of a girl named Shima Hall. Shima's parents sold her into slavery when she was 8 years old. She was smuggled into the United States when she was 10 years old. She worked as a domestic servant in Orange County, California, 16 hours a day, scrubbing floors, cooking meals. She was rarely allowed outside. She never visited a doctor, and she could not speak English. When she was 13, a concerned neighbor called in a tip to law enforcement. And Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, opened an investigation. Her captors were prosecuted, imprisoned, and then deported. Today, Shima Hall is a United States citizen, and her goal is to be an ICE agent because she wants to rescue others like her that she knows are hidden in plain sight in the United States. Shima's story helps us understand the important role the government can play in identifying, investigating, and prosecuting human trafficking. DHS is one of the lead federal law enforcement agencies engaged in combating human trafficking. Through its Homeland Security's investigations, HSI, DHS is responsible for investigating and preventing human trafficking both domestically and internationally. The U.S. Customs Border Protection, CBP, is in a unique position to detect human trafficking on our borders, as is the U.S. Coast Guard on our high seas, the Transportation Security Administration at airports and mass transit facilities, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, in disaster areas. Our investigatory authority, screening authority, and most of our assistant programs are authorized by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, and its subsequent reauthorizations. In 2010, DHS launched the Blue Campaign to combat human trafficking. The Blue Campaign began and continues with no direct appropriations. It reflects a belief that we can be highly effective when we work collaboratively with our internal and external partners. The Blue Campaign focuses on trainings so that we can detect human trafficking, as well as outreach so that we can prevent it from occurring. We have created specialized trainings and videos to educate state and local and tribal law enforcement officers at all levels on indicators of human trafficking. We want law enforcement to know how they can assist victims and to be aware of the full range of resources available to them when investigating trafficking. The Blue Campaign collaborated with the Department of State to create a general awareness training to educate the public on the indicators of human trafficking. We produced an informational video to help first responders identify possible victims of human trafficking. Just this summer, we entered into a partnership agreement with the National Association of Counties to work with county personnel to identify human trafficking. In 2002, DHS, along with the U.S. Department of Transportation, DOT, and Amtrak, entered a partnership to train all 20,000 Amtrak employees and the Amtrak Police Department to recognize indicators of human trafficking as well as how to report suspected cases. We also work with the airline industry. CBP recently, together with DOT, launched the Blue Lightning Initiative, a training program to educate airline employees on human trafficking and how to notify law enforcement. In fiscal year 2012, the HSI tip line received more human trafficking tips than ever before, 588 tips. We think that our efforts are working. During that same year, ICE HSI investigated more cases with a nexus to human trafficking than ever before, resulting in over 950 criminal arrests, 381 convictions, and seized assets of more than $1 million. This year, we are on pace to exceed last year's record numbers, having already initiated 940 human trafficking investigations. We take a victim-centered approach in our investigations. We have victim assistance specialists across the ICE offices all over the United States. We've also expanded our forensic interviewing program so that we have specially trained personnel to conduct the important interviews with the victims. One disturbing trend we have encountered is increased gang activity. This has been observed right here in Washington, D.C. ICE, in collaboration with the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force and our federal partners, recently investigated and successfully prosecuted cases where MS-13 gang members recruited girls as young as 12 years old from our schools, on the street, and through social media into sex trafficking. DHS, through its U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and ICE, provides immigration relief to eligible foreign trafficking victims. Immigration relief options assist law enforcement in stabilizing victims so that they may begin to recover and rebuild their lives. I am proud of what DHS has accomplished, but there is still so much to do. We are working more every day to expand our partnerships. We regularly interact with our stakeholders for new ideas and new innovative ways to combat this crime. The posters that we have here are a great example of exactly that. and they are available at dhs.gov/bluecampaign for anyone to download, print out, or we will give them hard copies. The first here says, "Lured by fairy tale promises, she learned not every prince is charming," picturing a teenage girl. That relates to sex trafficking. The next poster is in connection with labor trafficking. It states, "What good is a time card when his freedom clocked out long ago?" And our final poster goes to domestic servitude. It reflects a person like Shaima, enslaved in the home. It states, "Some prison cells have metal bars and some have picket fences." I appreciate the opportunity to represent the Blue Campaign and DHS before this committee, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have and work with you to find the answers to the very important questions that you've already posed. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Hill. Thanks very much, Mr. Dinkins. Thank you for being here as well. And Ms. Gannon, I think you're next up. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Chiesa, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the Department of Justice and FBI's efforts to combat the scourge of human trafficking. As evidenced by the broad spectrum of investigative, prosecutorial, training, outreach, victim services, and research efforts by a wide array of components, the Department is fully committed to fighting human trafficking. Human trafficking is a crime that strikes at the very heart of the American promise, freedom. Today in this country, people are bought, sold, and exploited like slaves each and every day. They are trapped in lives of misery, often beaten, starved, and forced to engage in prostitution or to take grueling jobs as migrant, domestic, restaurant, or factory workers with little or no pay. The Department and its partners are working hard to identify and support victims and bring their abusers to justice. We provide significant resources, training, and technical assistance to our federal, state, local, and tribal partners. The FBI's efforts to investigate human trafficking are coordinated by the Civil Rights Unit and the Violent Crimes Against Children section. The Civil Rights Unit investigates forced labor, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and the sexual exploitation of foreign minors, while the Violent Crimes Against Children section focuses on the commercial sexual exploitation of domestic children under the age of 18. Sex trafficking prosecutions involving children do not require proof of the use of force, fraud, or coercion. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the FBI's most prominent initiative to combat the growing problem of sex trafficking of children within the United States. In June of 2003, the FBI and the Department's Child Exploitation and Obscenity section joined the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to launch the Innocence Lost National Initiative. The FBI and its partners execute Operation Cross Country, a 3-day nationwide enforcement action focusing on underage victims of prostitution. Our 7th and most recent operation in July of 2013 concluded with the recovery of 105 commercially sexually exploited children and the arrest of 150 pimps and other individuals. To date, the task forces have rescued more than 2,800 children, and investigations have led to the conviction of more than 1,400 pimps, madams, and their associates. These convictions have resulted in multiple life sentences and the seizure of real property, vehicles, and monetary assets. Our Civil Rights Unit investigates trafficking involving foreign nationals, which is often aimed at recent migrants and other economically disadvantaged individuals, particularly women and children. Together with our law enforcement partners at DHS appearing here today with us, as well as the Departments of Labor and State, we are working hard to combat trafficking in any form, not only because of the physical and psychological toll it takes on individual victims and their families, but also the profits generated by this exploitation fuel further unlawful migration and organized criminal activity. The Department's prosecution efforts are led by 2 specialized units, the Civil Rights Division's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit and the Criminal Division's Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section, which provides subject matter expertise and partner with our 94 U.S. Attorney's offices on prosecutions nationwide. Taken together, these units initiated a total of 128 federal human trafficking prosecutions in fiscal year 2012, charging 200 defendants. During fiscal year 2012, DOJ convicted a total of 138 traffickers in cases involving forced labor and sex trafficking of adults and children. The Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit works to enhance investigations and prosecutions of significant human trafficking cases, particularly novel, complex, multi-jurisdictional, and multi-agency cases, and those involving transnational organized crime and financial crimes. DOJ units have continued to lead the 6 anti-trafficking coordination teams, or ACT teams, in collaboration with FBI, DHS, and the Department of Labor. These ACT teams, through enhanced coordination among federal prosecutors and multiple federal investigative agencies, have developed significant human trafficking investigations and prosecutions. The Department and DHS have collaborated with Mexican law enforcement counterparts on the U.S.-Mexico Human Trafficking Bilateral Enforcement Initiative, which has contributed significantly to restoring the rights and dignity of human trafficking victims through outreach, interagency coordination, international collaboration, and capacity building. The Child Exploitation Section coordinates and participates in training for federal, state, local, and international prosecutors and investigators engaged in efforts to enforce federal child exploitation laws. For example, in 2013, staff presented on best practices for investigating and prosecuting child sex trafficking cases at a human trafficking seminar in California and participated in a Crimes Against Children training conference located in Vietnam. All U.S. attorneys' offices established or participate in human trafficking task forces and collaborate with private partners in several ways. 80% of these task forces include members from a diverse set of non-governmental organizations, community groups, faith-based organizations, victim advocacy groups, academic organizations, medical professionals, and legal aid offices. The department does more than investigate and prosecute those who exploit victims of trafficking. For example, DOJ's victim specialists and non-government victim assistance service providers work with human trafficking victims to advise them of their rights and to ensure they get the help they need to address their short-term and long-term needs, such as legal and repatriation services, immigration relief, housing, employment, education, job training, and childcare. In fiscal year 2012, the Department's Bureau of Justice Assistance and Office for Victims of Crime jointly made awards to 7 task force sites to execute a comprehensive approach to combating all forms of trafficking, including sex and labor trafficking of foreign nationals and U.S. citizens. During fiscal years 2012 and 2013, the Office for Victims of Crime represented DOJ by serving as a co-chair along with DHS and the Department of Health and Human Services in the development of the first ever federal strategic action plan to strengthen services for trafficking victims. The plan is scheduled for release in January of 2014. The National Institute of Justice has maintained the most active research portfolio on trafficking in the United States, making dozens of research awards over the past decade. Recent awards are tackling the toughest questions asked about human trafficking, including measuring the prevalence of labor trafficking, exploring the perpetration of trafficking, and evaluating best practices in service provision. In April of 2013, the Attorney General, on a recommendation from the Defending Childhood Task Force, called for the formation of the American Indian and Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence Task Force. An initial focus will be actions to improve the federal response to the needs of American Indian and Alaska Native children exposed to violence. This vulnerable population has been identified as being particularly susceptible to being lured by traffickers. On behalf of Deputy Assistant Director Campbell and myself, we thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today, and would now welcome any questions you may have.
Ms. Gannon, thank you, and Mr. Campbell, thank you for joining us as well. Before I start the question, I just want to make a quick note, if I could. Senator McCain's wife, Cindy, as many of you may know, has been involved in the fight against human trafficking for some time, both in her own state as the co-chair of the governor's task force against human trafficking, or on human trafficking. She's worked outside of her state. She's worked even internationally, I think most recently with the First Lady of Mexico. And I know you're very proud of her, and would you just convey our thanks to her for the great work that she is doing, John. I want to go back a couple of years. The year I was elected governor, I said, why don't we focus as an administration for 4 years or 8 years, however long I was going to get to be governor of Delaware, and just focus on the underlying causes. Underlying causes, why does a kid start school behind? Why do they fall further behind? Why do they become disruptive in classes? Why do they drop out, get suspended, expelled, end up in crime, or dependent on all of us in welfare and that sort of thing? Why? And we focused really for 8 years on underlying causes. We focused on teenage pregnancies, how to reduce them. I saw the other day that teen pregnancies are down by half in this country since 1992, the year I was elected governor. And we were encouraged by that. We focused a whole lot on parenting training for people, including people in prison, because most of them were parents. They weren't very good parents. They didn't have very exceptionally good parents either. We focused on the value of early childhood education. So we went after the root causes. And what I want to do, my question, that's a way of telegraphing this pitch, what I mentioned in my opening statement, root causes. Root causes, which in some cases, the cause is what makes the traffickers want to traffic. $32 billion could be part of the reason. And what makes those who they end up recruiting or basically pressing into the servitude, what makes the victims willing to do that or unable to escape that? Can we just talk about underlying causes? And we'll just start with you, Judge Hill, if you will, please, and then we'll go from our left to our right. Please, Judge Hill. Underlying causes.
Looking at the perspective of the traffickers, I think for them, unfortunately, this has proven to be a lucrative form of criminal activity. And it is difficult to prosecute these cases. The victims are so traumatized. They have suffered such psychological damage. They have fear for their children, fear for themselves, their families, that they are sometimes unable to tell their stories. Indeed, when ICE, HSI encounters victims in the field, often they don't recognize that they are victims. They have suffered such brutalization that they are unable to recognize what has occurred. And often they are unable initially to testify regarding what occurred. I speak as a former judge and a former prosecutor.
I'm going to interrupt if I may. Let's go back just a little bit before they're actually have been recruited or pressed into this kind of servitude. Just go back before that, if you will. How does it get started?
What we know
is there anything that we can do at that very early juncture?
Certainly, what we know is that with regard to sex trafficking in the United States of girls and boys, we know that many of these children have suffered trauma in the home and have suffered previous sexual abuse. We also know that many of them are runaways, and that the more times, a study in Texas has shown, that the more times a child runs away, the more likely that they are going to be the victims of human trafficking. So we know that also poverty may drive this crime. We know that we have individuals who are seeking affection. This is a common, particularly for some of our international victims. They fall in love, I use that in quotes, ostensibly with their trafficker. We have seen families where the victim moves in with the trafficker's family. A child is born to the victim and the trafficker, and then the child is held by the family, and the trafficker takes the victim north to the United States, in many instances, to be trafficked here. So there are a whole host of reasons. I don't think we have full understanding, but we certainly have some indicators that help us know which populations are more vulnerable. And one of them, we are very concerned about what's occurring in our schools, as is the Department of Education and our work with them, to make sure that our schools are also not an opportunity for traffickers who recognize that this is a profitable form of crime. And I'll just say, because these cases are difficult to prosecute, the victims have challenges in coming forward to tell their story, it makes it an attractive crime because the deterrence is not there. It's harder to prosecute.
Good. Those are great points. Thank you. Mr. Dinkins, want to add to that or take away?
Yes, sir, real quickly. One of the things we've seen with our foreign nationals that come in to the United States and end up becoming victims of sex trafficking or labor trafficking is those are individuals who are coming to America to live the American dream. So they're coming here with some type of idea that they'll get educated or they'll work in a home and get stable employment, when really they're coming here to fall prey on criminals who are seeking to exploit individuals, gang members who that's their motive of operation, is to prey on weak people. And they find, with foreign nationals here, they don't have the support system of their family. They find their travel documents held by their traffickers, and so they have no place to turn in a foreign country. But ultimately, they came here to live the American dream. And as far as what we've seen is, I think we have to also remember is many of these children, as you've mentioned, is as young as 13 years old being sex trafficked. These are pedophiles that are out seeking them. So there's another underlying industry who's actually seeking out to have sex with a minor, which is something that we also have to look at as much as we are those who are trafficking them, as those who are actually seeking to have sex with young children.
All right, thank you. Ms. Gannon? Underlying causes, please.
Thank you. Yes, in terms of traffickers, traffickers view these victims as a commodity. For drugs, they can be sold once. For individuals that are smuggled, they can be transported once. But a person who is held in a trafficking situation, whether it be labor or sex, can be used and sold multiple times. And unfortunately, everyone from transnational organized crime to gangs to individual traffickers have realized this. And they view this as a business, and they use these victims to gain monetary advantage. In terms of the underlying causes for the victims, unfortunately, poverty is an issue that drives people to seek a better life and to seek economic and employment opportunities where the traffickers have no intention of complying with the compensation that they promised. In addition, we see victims with no or precarious immigration status, as my colleague from DHS mentioned, and that makes them particularly vulnerable and reluctant to report. In addition, we see young girls and boys with a desire to be loved who may be, as Judge Hill mentioned, runaways from the foster care system, and that makes them particularly vulnerable as well. They may be living on the streets, and a trafficker presents the first person to show them security and love, and that person then betrays them as well and forces them into prostitution or a forced labor situation.
Thanks. Mr. Campbell, please.
Yes, Chairman. I'd reiterate what Ms. Gannon said as far as the children who are homeless from disadvantaged homes or just have self-esteem. And quite often, we understand that within 48 hours of being on the street as a runaway, they're quite often approached by traffickers and lured into the trade with this person actually says that they love them, starts to take care of them, brings them into their home, and sort of lures them into the trade itself. Some are affiliated with gang members. They might be family members of gang members, friends of gang members, and the gang itself is involved in trafficking or becomes involved in it. And then those people are either lured into it or violently persuaded to become prostitutes, child prostitutes, and so forth. And in some cases, individuals are simply kidnapped and forcibly held. And that leads also to that. And I think it brings home the importance of training local law enforcement, our tribal partners, community organizations, school educators, et cetera, as far as recognizing where this can happen. I'm sure many of you know of stories where children have been lured from so-called prominent high schools, places that you would know where your kids or other kids of your friends go, and it would come as a surprise to you that kids could be lured from a place like that, but it happens all the time, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go back to, again, we focused for 8 years in Delaware on how do we strengthen the basic building block for society families. And the thought occurs to me, to the extent that, that we did that in order to make sure that kids did a better job in school. Started prepared, finished, didn't drop out. Ended up not being a burden to the rest of us, not ending up in the criminal justice system, and we did it by focusing on the basic building block of our society. And I'm just reminded here that maybe that's part of addressing the underlying symptoms. Here, I'm going to telegraph my next pitch when we come back. In the National Governors Association, I don't know, John, what it was like in those Attorney Generals Association, but National Governors Association, we had a Center for Best Practices that was like a clearinghouse for good ideas. And I always used to say to my cabinet, every problem that we're facing in Delaware, some state has addressed that problem and figured out how to address it. how to solve that problem. And when we come back, a question I'm going to ask you is, are there any other countries out there that we ought to be looking at to see what they're doing, how they've dealt with the underlying problems, and also the symptoms of those problems. Mr. Chiesa, Senator Chiesa, you're going to be with us for too short a time. Senator Chiesa is only here for a limited duration, and we've very much enjoyed his presence and membership with this committee and in the Senate. And again, I want to thank him and Senator Heitkamp for suggesting we have this hearing. Jeff, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to all of you for being here. I appreciate not only your expertise on this issue, but your passion for it. We talk about this horrific act by identifying the people as property. And that is a concept that is so foreign to anybody that lives in this country. And one of the things that's particularly troubling to me is the way certain aspects of our business community can reinforce this concept. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about. This February, the Super Bowl is going to be in New Jersey. And we know, and we've been preparing for that for a number of years on a bunch of levels, security levels for sure, but also because we know that traffickers follow these international events around. And we know that there's an increased demand for it. We saw it in Dallas, we saw it in Indianapolis. And one of the really troubling things that we see as a result are web-based companies that advertise people as property on their websites. And I've had a chance to review some of these ads, and you will see children advertised in these ads with obvious signs of abuse on their bodies. They don't even try to hide it. They put girls on these ads, young girls on their ads with bruises all over their bodies that prosecutors and detectives and agents will tell you are obvious signs of physical and sexual abuse. And they don't even care. And what I want to talk to you about is I understand that we are not in the business, or I don't believe we're in the business of regulating speech and content. I have no interest in doing that. But I do have an interest in talking about businesses whose business model it is to advertise people as property. And what I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Judge Hill, and I appreciate the chance to meet with you last week, what can the federal government do with web-based companies that are engaging in these advertisements that promote and encourage child exploitation? What can the federal government do to better monitor and take action against these companies?
This is a challenging area for us because as soon as we, and I'm sure Mr. Dinkins can share with you, as soon as we hone in on a particular advertiser, it's pretty elusive. They can disappear and reappear in some other format. So it's a challenge for us on an investigatory basis. Certainly, we applaud the efforts that are happening in the private business world of companies saying that they will not participate in human trafficking, either with their supply chains or in other methods of simply not having them participate in this effort at all. We believe that we need to continue to educate the American public so that they will also express similar outrage as we have with other issues and see the change in the public view. But at first, we need to have the American public recognize that there is a problem here in the United States. And frankly, in my discussions as I've gone out, I don't think that necessarily state and local law enforcement even believe that there's a problem. And they may not even believe that these ads would affect their community. Once we've had a chance to share with them our training and our knowledge, almost universally, and this is borne out by the research of the Department of Justice, there's a recognition, and then there's a heightened scrutiny, and that's where I think we need to start, is we need to have all of our law enforcement partners recognize that this is a challenge for us and collaborate and find those best practices that will help us attack it.
Thank you. Mr. Dinkins.
No, absolutely. I think this is an area that we can all agree on, that we can't arrest our way out of it. And I think that by educating people, it really bears out the results that we've seen on the enforcement side, because we were able to identify early on red flag indicators of abuse. And you're talking about the web base, and this wasn't my idea, but we certainly got some good investigative leads out of it. There's a private institution, a banking institution, that did just what you did. They searched the internet looking for individuals advertising commercial sex on the internet. Then they looked at those same web addresses and phone numbers and contact information to see, are they also advertising overseas in at-risk countries for au pairs and for employment opportunities in the United States by doing a bait and switch. And we actually came up with some very good leads on there. And that's great to create investigations, but the best way to do it is not have the ads and have those web housers actually housing that type of material in the beginning. And usually, as Judge Hild mentioned, is once we educate private businesses and web companies, they take action very quickly to rid themselves. Nobody wants to be contributing to human trafficking.
Thanks. Same question, Ms. Gannon.
Thank you. The department shares your serious concerns about the use of the internet to perpetrate these types of crimes, and particularly against these vulnerable victims. The department has had successful investigations and prosecutions related to online advertisements of minors for sex trafficking. And just 2 weeks ago, I attended meetings where I was informed about the utilization and leveraging of technology to look for missing children in these ads. It's something the department takes very seriously. As a general matter, any prosecution of a website or an individual who's purchasing these types of services requires the government, whether it be state or federal, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the website operators actually knew or had reasonable cause to believe that the advertisement was for a sexual act as opposed to a legal service, and that the individual depicted in the advertisement in the instance of minor sex trafficking is under the age of 18. We will continue to aggressively combat human trafficking, whether it takes place online or off, and we are certainly cognizant of the unique factors that this type of trafficking advertisements present. We have also, while our primary focus is on the traffickers of these victims because they are primarily responsible for the cause harm to the victim, we have also engaged as a department in demand-side enforcement. And through operations, we have looked at the purchasers of these type of sexual services on the internet. And in the case of U.S. versus Youngers out of the 8th Circuit, the department pursued an affirmative appeal when the district court rejected those charges against a purchaser, and the 8th Circuit agreed with the department and found that the existing human trafficking federal statute 1591 does apply to purchasers of sexual services on the internet.
Okay, and I hope you'll continue to let this committee know about things that they can do to strengthen your ability to bring those prosecutions because they're so important. And Mr. Chairman, if I may have Mr. Campbell also respond to the same question. Thank you.
Yes, Senator. Where these websites are in some way supporting, according to the criteria of the statute, human trafficking, sex trafficking, we're certainly going to work closely with the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute those. Some of those companies are more cooperative than others in regard to that issue, and we continue to work with them to increase that cooperation and really focus in this area. If I may, I wanted to say something about these special events. You alluded to the Super Bowl. One thing that these ads do is demonstrate to us when there might be an increase of human trafficking, prostitution, et cetera, at these types of special events. Could be a sporting event, could be a large business convention, some other type of event at any location in the United States. And we see from the proliferation of ads that there might be an influx of pimps bringing in their adults and children, because children are normally embedded in adult also prostitution rings. And in that case, what we do through our Crimes Against Children interagency task forces is we begin gathering more intelligence about where this might occur. We look at social media sites, we look at the areas, the street tracks where they're being trafficked, We work through our other sources of information, even in drug areas and other gang areas, to obtain information. We train our local partners on what to look for as well. We partner with local community services for them also to be focused in case we can do a rescue and they can provide services to them in that event. We use our victim assistance services as well. So it's an important focus area for us, and we're going to continue to be focused in that area as these events do occur around the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Senator Heitkamp, thank you again so much for
you.
for bringing us here.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just so critically important that we get on top of this. And I look at this problem as kind of an hourglass. And Senator Carper, I think, has done a great job asking you to think about all of the potential victims out there and how do we avoid sending them into the pipeline to continue to be victims. And we all know that a lot of the runaways that we're talking about already were sexual assault victims. And that's the dirty little secret about runaway kids. They're usually running away from a condition like that. Then we've got all the bad guys who would exploit all those kids. But then we've got all the people who serve to be the customers of the bad guys. And we've learned from our work in domestic violence that there is a way to begin to have deterrence against those people who would participate either on either end in terms of, you know, I hate to use the word shaming, but, you know, certainly before, if this was simply a family matter, it was a lot easier. But when it became a public matter and a crime against everyone in this country, which this one is, it's not just these victims. It's crime against every person in this country and the sensibility of every person in this country. So I want to go to the demand side. And you've already begun that process of talking about it, but somehow we have got to reduce the demand and the kind of sense that it's okay to do this. It's okay to hire someone into domestic servitude. It's okay to use a prostitute, and maybe I don't know her age or his age. It's okay to run your factory on less than minimum wage. All of that's okay. So I want you all to give me a couple ideas on how we build better deterrence into this system. And I want to start with you, Mr. Campbell. I'm sure you have horrific stories that you could tell this committee of situations, but I want to know what additional kind of tools we could provide or that could be provided to law enforcement to investigate these and these demand side.
Right. Well, certainly the types of media campaigns that we conduct, such as when we did Operation Cross Country, where we put the word out to the public in regard to what to look for child trafficking, the vulnerable communities to look in, and partnering with community agencies and so forth, and exposing to the public, as you said, the fact that this does exist and that it is illegal and it's being vigorously investigated by partnerships of federal and local agencies.
But do you believe that, I mean, I understand that that may lead to more investigations and more complaints, but I'm talking about preventing the marketplace from working.
Yes.
But how do we, you know, we used to take and talk about publishing the name of every person who was engaged in spousal abuse, you know, on the you know, you've got the 10 most wanted. I mean, I'm trying to get at what's going to stop people from demanding these services or using the services of human beings who are trafficked.
Well, certainly we've named individuals to the top 10 most wanted, in fact, who are egregious offenders, even at an international type scale, as a way of exposing individuals. And we support local law enforcement in regard to what they do with information that they can use to expose these individuals as well and put them in local newspapers and that type of thing. But I would respectfully also submit that a vigorous prosecution of these individuals that's nationally known, that's very effective, that results in large sweeps of rescuing victims, arresting pimps, a lot of times either ourselves or the locals arresting the Johns, as they call them, that type of thing. I would submit that media exposure of that activity acts as a deterrent as well.
Ms. Gannon?
Thank you. I think that your comparison to the domestic violence situation is very appropriate. This trafficking is not a private matter. It is not, as Judge Hill was talking about, the young girl who was held in Orange County. It was a neighbor who came forward and reported that. And many years ago, perhaps in a domestic violence situation, people would have turned the other way and thought that it wasn't their problem. But through public awareness of trafficking, we're encouraging people to come forward when they see something that looks wrong. When they see, a young girl on the street, they might think twice and call law enforcement and say, this girl is in an area known for prostitution. She doesn't, look to be 18. She doesn't look to be of age, and that would raise particular concern for them. The department has conducted research in this area, specifically the National Institute of Justice commissioned a study regarding demand-side enforcement and its effectiveness, and there's a website that provides information on the effectiveness of those programs as it relates to prostitution specifically. As my colleague from the FBI stated, the Innocence Lost National Initiative and Operation Cross Country, through that media attention, it does create a dialogue, and hopefully that dialogue is happening at schools when students read about this operation. It's happening at the dinner table where people can talk about it and discuss how this is an affront to the very basic nature of our country.
Ms. Gannon, and I don't mean not to ask the other ones, but I did want to get a specific question in on Indian country.
Absolutely.
Because of its jurisdictional complexities, presents some real challenges, and obviously federal officials have a great deal of jurisdiction and are looked to as the savior. I know that you were recently in North Dakota. Thank you for that visit, and wondering if you can offer any insights about strategies in Indian country that we should be pursuing.
Actually, I have not had the opportunity to go to North Dakota, although I would love to. But specifically with regard to Indian country, I think there are opportunities that we have and that need to be addressed. Specifically, I've been working with members of the Office of Tribal Justice to increase public awareness. And I know that the U.S. Attorney's offices have been very active and have been looking to increase their number of Special Assistant United States Attorneys from tribal prosecutors' offices who are best situated to be in the community and to work together with the U.S. Attorney's offices to encourage reporting and to successfully prosecute Indian country cases.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you want Mr. Dinkinson and Judge Hill to respond? Go ahead. If you do, go ahead, and then we'll recognize Kelly if she comes back and John if she doesn't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I would love to hear the other
Please.
two responses.
Just be
but
fairly brief.
I don't want to use up all my
Just
time.
be fairly brief. Thanks.
Reducing the demand, as you suggested, I think is a key. I think that having strong sentences, which we've seen for servitude type of cases, has been very powerful and puts folks on warning. It's probably a little more challenging when it comes to the commercial sex environment, particularly if it does involve children. As I mentioned earlier, that's a social illness that unfortunately is too common. And I don't think that even sending pedophiles away for 30 years will prevent another pedophile from possibly taking action. So I think that we need other avenues for treatment and to deal with that type of issue. But definitely the heavy sentences, we're seeing life sentences in some cases for...
I do have a question, Mr. Dinkins, because I was one of the leaders on civil commitment of sex offenders, a lot of which are pedophiles, repeat offender pedophiles. Have you seen anything coming out of those treatment programs that it would encourage the department or encourage us to believe that this is a treatable problem?
I'm not really that suited for it, but I'm very skeptical that it is a treatable problem.
I would like to address the demand side question. The National Association of Attorney Generals, approximately 2 years ago, started their 4-pillar campaign, and one of the pillars was to address the demand side. As you all, as former attorney generals, are well aware, much of this prosecution occurs in the state courts, and there's an estimate 95% of criminal conduct is addressed in the state courts. One of the things that we have been working on at DHS, given my prior background as a state court judge, is to educate the judges. I believe that when I was on the municipal court, there were victims of human trafficking coming through my courtroom as defendants. I believe that they were pleading guilty to prostitution charges. I can remember someone sitting in the back, the pimp, staring me down and the prostitute, but I simply didn't understand the dynamics of what was occurring. I didn't know that that person in all likelihood couldn't enter a voluntary plea because they were being coerced into prostitution. This is an area where the judges need to be educated as they were with domestic violence. They were taught about the cycle of violence and why a victim would recant her testimony or his testimony at trial. Similar education is needed here to help address the issue of victims being re-victimized through our court system. I think that will also help drive the discussion on how the state courts should address the demand side, particularly for sex trafficking.
Thank you. Senator McCain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At least 6 departments and agencies are authorized to receive $127 million in funding to combat human trafficking. Of that $127 million, $21 million is for investigations and prosecution of human trafficking in the United States. Maybe the witnesses could provide for the record what that $106 million that's not spent for investigations and prosecution is spent on. So the witnesses would provide for the record what their various agencies spend and on what, I'd be very interested. Ms. Hill, was that you in that film there?
No, it was not me.
Yeah, someone looked a lot like you. I know about advertising. That's not a very good message. That showed 2 people bumping into each other and spilling their lunch. If you really want to have a message that will strike home to people, show the young lady that Ms. Gannon was talking about. Show the people that have been victimized in a way that makes us so repulsed that we don't even want to think about it. That's been the most effective ads on things like smoking. So I don't know how much you spent on that, but it isn't it's a muddled message. People knocking each other down while having lunch is not a very effective message. I hope you'll review it. And there's enough compelling stories as associated with horrible crime that I think you could get the message through a lot more effectively. Mr. Dinkins, how strong is the linkage between drug cartels and human trafficking that are operating across mainly our southern border?
There's definitely a linkage. While not all drug trafficking organizations that we've seen in Mexico and throughout the United States are engaged, we definitely have seen some trafficking organizations, drug trafficking organizations involved in both human smuggling as well as human trafficking.
Did you see the July 31st Time magazine article that said the Mexican drug cartels, other business, sex trafficking, that pointed out particularly that Mexican cartels like the Zetas have become heavily involved in the human trafficking business from Mexico?
I definitely have seen many of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations have morphed into more organized crime, and they're willing to make money in any way that they can, sir.
Well, you've seen it. How serious is the problem?
It's very problem. Well, both drug smuggling as well as the human trafficking is very significant.
The subject of this hearing is about human trafficking. Mr. Campbell, what evidence have you seen?
Yes, well, as Ms. Gannon mentioned in her statement, we have the bilateral agreement with Mexico, and the purpose of that and then is to share information and work against those cartels in all of the criminal activities that they are engaged in, and certainly this is an area of primary focus for the FBI.
And have you seen it grow larger, less, the same? What trends are you seeing on that? The information we have is that organizations like the Zetas originally were simply in drug trafficking, and they have branched out into other areas, including human trafficking, including other money laundering and some other activities. Have you seen an increase in the human trafficking across the Mexican border by the cartels?
Senator, I don't have the information right now on the specifics of the growth of human trafficking related to
Well,
the
have you got
border,
an
but I can
estimate?
provide that.
Have you got an estimate?
I do not, sir. I can provide you some other information, but I can tell you that human trafficking in general across the United States, unfortunately, is a growing problem. It is trending upward, Senator.
Ms. Gannon, one of the disturbing facts of this horrible stuff is that 95% of the young women and men who are subjected to this have a cell phone, and yet they never call in to get relief from the terrible situation they're in. That's because of physical and mental debasement? Is that, what's your take on that?
There is definitely an element of fear and retaliation. These traffickers are ruthless in manipulating their victims and putting fear of physical violence and substantiated fear. They beat them, they tattoo them, they hold them in isolation. And so even if they do have a means of communication, many are reluctant to come forward. I think the way to address that is by increasing public awareness, getting that hotline out there in the right places, whether it be truck stops, transportation hubs, so if they are moving, they have a chance to see it, and also the engagement of community and faith-based organizations. So if that trafficking victim does go to a juvenile shelter at some point, that person at the shelter is trained to identify the signs of trafficking, knows what to do, who the appropriate person at the local police department or federal agency is to call, and gives that victim some assurance that they will be treated with respect. Law enforcement is there to help them, not arrest and hurt them, and that they can trust them in order to come forward, and they will receive the victim services that they so desperately need.
The Super Bowl is the largest, the Texas Attorney General said the Super Bowl is the largest single human trafficking incident in the United States history. That's a stunning statement. Do you think maybe we ought to have some of our people on hand, Mr. Dinkins, during the Super Bowl?
Absolutely, sir. And we're actually already working on that. Both myself and the Bureau have teams in preparing in advance of the Super Bowl to both educate the state and locals as well as businesses and NGOs to be on the lookout for human trafficking.
Well, if it's the largest single human trafficking incident in United States history, you shouldn't have too much difficulty detecting that, I would think. Finally, I'm a little interested, I'm somewhat interested in this. 6 different departments and agencies are involved in this. Are you satisfied with the level of cooperation, Ms. Hill?
I am. I think that there has been a remarkable partnership among the personnel that are present here, as well as DHS has entered into partnerships with agencies across the federal government, as well as the National Association of Counties. I think that on this issue, the folks that are involved work remarkably well together. All of us share a belief that modern slavery has to come to an end. Certainly, there may be minor instances, but in my experience, we have worked closely together and shared resources, shared ideas, shared best practices to become more effective. Just in the time that I have been working on this issue, I have witnessed this myself.
Well, I'm glad to hear of your confidence. I'm sorry that since it seems that human trafficking is on the rise, your dedication has not shown the results that perhaps we might like to see. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator McGinn. And again, our thanks to Cindy for all of her efforts in this regard. Johnny spent a lot of years in the Navy about the same time, actually. he was a hero. I was just a guy who flew around in the planes. Was lucky enough that we didn't get shot down. But this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. And there's also a real shared responsibility here. It just can't be law enforcement. You just can't be the federal government, just can't be the state government, it can't be nonprofits, it's got to be all of us. And John's point is a really good one. We're spending a fair amount of money, and the question of how well we're coordinating what we do. And as much as we're trying to do a good job, everything I do, I know I can do better, and obviously this is something we have to do better as well, making sure we're not duplicating, but we're coordinating, and each of us playing an appropriate role. Senator Ayotte, recovering Attorney General Ayotte, please.
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses. I wanted to get at the issue of, to follow up on what Senator McCain was asking about. I was struck, Judge Hill, when I heard you testify about the numbers from 2012, that these were improvements on the past with 950 arrests, 381 convictions, and $1 million in forfeiture. And that struck me as fairly small, given some of the estimates of what the problem is here. How big is this problem in our country that obviously is a horrific criminal problem? But those numbers, you know, just looking even from a state attorney general perspective, just, you know, I'm glad that you're working really hard to improve them, but I just was really struck by, given the size of the United States and given the issues that we've heard about this morning, this afternoon.
Good data in this area remains a challenge. There's a number of efforts, as you've heard, in the Department of Justice and elsewhere to get good data. One caution I would give with regard to the data that I gave, I am confident that that underestimates what is actually occurring across the United States. And the reason for that is because prosecutors and judges may not choose to prosecute cases under a new statute, the human trafficking statute. It requires additional proof that they may not need for a rape or kidnapping charge. It requires proof of force, fraud, or coercion. To prove that, in almost all instances, you will need the testimony of the victim. And sometimes, as we've discussed, the victim is going to be unable to tell his or her story in the courtroom. So the prosecutors may choose another charge that requires a lower level of proof, confident that they will get a similar sentence or hopeful that they'll get a similar sentence. They'll use their discretion to make sure the conduct is addressed, even if it's not addressed under the federal anti-human trafficking statute or the statutes that we now have in close to 50 states. I don't think that those statutes are used as widely as we know the problem is because, and this is based on my experience as a prosecutor and as a judge, an unfamiliar statute is a deterrent to the prosecutor and the judge. They want to make sure that the prosecution, if it's successful, does remain a successful conviction. And this is probably a little inside baseball, but for a judge, the most likely place of reversal is on jury instructions, and the time that that will occur was with a new statute, untested statute. So they're built-in deterrents. Department of Justice has looked at this as well as terms of prosecutors, why there aren't as many human trafficking convictions. So these numbers, the trend is positive. The absolute numbers, I do not believe, reflect what is actually occurring in the United States, but I don't have those numbers for you. I can only share what my own experience in how these new statutes play out.
Do we have the right statute? Meaning, have there been any difficulties with the statute itself? I mean, Ms. Gannon, you mentioned the Younger case in the 8th Circuit, in which the Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the district court decision on basically holding the purchaser accountable under the trafficking statute. So is that been settled, or do we expect that, are there any conflict among the circuits, or is there any issue that needs to be clarified from us in terms of the federal statute?
Just to make sure I was clear, in the Younger's case, the 8th Circuit said that the statute does apply to purchasers.
Right, but it's obviously one Circuit Court of Appeals. Is there any conflict there, or is that issue fairly resolved in terms of prosecution across the country of these types of crimes? Because if we can't prosecute the purchasers, then we are not obviously going to get at this crime, because the purchasers need to be fully prosecuted, held up, and the public needs to understand that those purchasers are going to be prosecuted. They will be as my colleague certainly said, Senator Heitkamp, that they will be know publicly the crimes that they've committed, because that's how we're going to discourage this also on the purchasing end. So I just want to make sure that there aren't any legal issues that we should be aware of.
No, Senator, and there is no conflict among the circuits with regard to the application of 1591 to purchasers, and I can tell you that enforcement actions focused on purchasers, the demand side of trafficking, have occurred throughout the country. A few years ago, the Justice Department expanded the Project Safe Childhood program to include minor sex trafficking domestically, and there is a very active listserv among federal prosecutors about techniques, jury instructions, how to apply these laws, in addition to the subject matter experts here in Washington, which field calls. So we are working to make sure that the prosecutors in the field know how to use this law and how to apply it appropriately.
And one thing that leapt out at me as we talked about the issue of coordination, and obviously many of these victims, vulnerable victims, too many of them children, is part of the group that's coordinating in all this, the ICTAC
Absolutely.
task forces, because I had the familiarity of working with my ICAC task force in New Hampshire, and frankly, it's just shocking the amount of child pornography and sexual exploitation that is occurring over the internet. And so I see this as obviously a tool that these traffickers could be using as well.
Absolutely. The Internet Crimes Against Children task forces are active in this effort as well, and they are funded and organized through our Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which I should have mentioned earlier as one of the organizations which really can address the root causes and reasons why some of these children find themselves in such a vulnerable area. And another nice thing about the task force program in this instance is it really builds a bridge that has already existed for many years now between the federal and state and local law enforcement. And so adding trafficking awareness in a way that already has a structure in which the Department of Homeland Security and FBI participate in this program can maximize. And then in my experience as a federal prosecutor in California, what happened was that I then began speaking with the local district attorney's office, and so that there is coordination as the state attorneys general have focused on this issue, the state legislatures have focused on this issue and passed state laws, which may be very similar to the federal laws or slightly different, that the prosecutors at that level can also sit down and have a discussion about where most appropriately to pursue the case, factoring in everything from the elements necessary to the possible penalties to what's appropriate for the victim, the duration of the case. And I engaged in many conversations with my local prosecutor colleagues. So that is an area where the numbers also, I think we're going to see an increase both in federal investigations and prosecutions, and as the states continue to engage in this issue, we'll see it in both systems.
I want to thank all of you, and I know my time has expired, but one of the things we did when I was Attorney General is we did an internet safety booklet that went into all of our schools, and I did that in partnership with the ICAC, getting their advice on in task force to see what that should say. And so I think that is a natural partnership, because they're doing, at the local level, a lot of the partners in the ICAC task force are doing education in the schools in addition to their law enforcement function of enforcing the laws. So I'm glad to hear that you're working with that task force, because I think that's a natural partner right there. Thank you.
Senator, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today and for all that you bring to this hearing. You know what I was thinking? Senator Heitkamp, about some things you said the other day when you were in Delaware talking about the Truth Campaign. And I'm sure our attorney generals remember not that many years ago, maybe a dozen or so years ago, the attorney generals of our country, and Senator Heitkamp was one of the leaders in this, but negotiated a settlement with all 50 states, negotiated a settlement with the tobacco industry to reduce, to deter young people from starting to use tobacco, and if they'd already started, to just encourage them to quit. Remarkably successful effort. And I ended up being the founding vice chairman of the American Legacy Foundation, which was created out of this effort. And in terms of a public awareness campaign, literally shaped by young people, by kids and teenagers, preteens, who helped shape the messages called the Truth Campaign, hard-hitting, really, to the gut. And all kinds of media, multimedia efforts in a lot of places where, like, TV shows, movies, you know, venues that people our age, at least my age, would never see. But boy, it worked with the kids. And when I'm thinking about best practices and what worked in terms of reducing young people's use of tobacco, desire to find it attractive, incredibly successful. Teen pregnancy campaign, I alluded to that earlier. Teen pregnancy rates in this country since 1992 are down by half. Pretty amazing achievement if you think about it. And the challenge that's before us in this regard is daunting. But in terms of maybe some campaigns, teen pregnancy, tobacco use among young people that have been remarkably successful literally in the last decade or two, maybe there's some lessons we can learn from them. I said earlier that I telegraphed my pitch. I said I was going to come back to you and ask you to look around the world. To look around the world at other countries. This is a problem not just here, but in a lot of other countries. Advanced countries, developing countries, developed countries. But just think for us out loud about some best practices in other parts of the world where they're grappling with this and they're having some success in, either on the supply side or the demand side, please. And Judge, would you go first?
I think that we have looked internationally, certainly at the Blue Campaign, and I'll just explain how we came up with the term.
And I'm going to have to ask you to be pretty brief, if you will.
Sure. The Blue Campaign, it's a reference to the United Kingdom's efforts to combat human trafficking, the UN Office of Drugs and Children, Drugs and Crime, Blue Heart Campaign to combat human trafficking, as well as a reference to the Thin Blue Line. We've also entered into bilateral agreements with a number of nations to work together on capacity building efforts with them. All of this similar in other nations. They need to build their capacity just as we need to build here. And so we look to their trainings and their other offerings to make sure that ours makes sense. Finally, we've entered into an agreement with Interpol so that we can learn together the best ways internationally to combat human trafficking.
Good, thank you. Mr. Dinkins, just very briefly.
Sir, yeah, I'm not sure if one country anywhere in the world actually has found the silver bullet to combat human trafficking, but we.
I like to say there are a lot of silver BBs. Maybe one of them has. We
That's
pick
true.
up some silver BBs from different places.
But we definitely are sharing ideas and practices, and as Judge Hill mentioned, I think a big important part of what we're doing is for those, making sure that the weaker countries that don't have that experience, we're bringing them up to the same level as the rest of the developed world, and we're actively doing that.
All right, thanks. Ms. Gannon.
Yes, we work with the Department of State, who issues a international trafficking in persons report, and that is a good tool to look at the challenges and successes that other countries have engaged in to address this issue. Our subject matter experts in the crimes, child exploitation and obscenity section and human trafficking prosecution unit work extensively with international partners to address exactly what you're discussing in terms of best practices, and in particular the child exploitation and obscenity section is quite active in international trainings and meetings.
All right, Mr. Campbell.
Yes, we recently had an arrest of a top 10 fugitive involved in this type of activity in another country. A lot of cooperation there. We're seeing cooperation from the Philippines, Thailand, and we work very closely with Interpol and Europol as well, and we're involved in 40 different international task forces regarding child trafficking, child sex tourism, that type of thing.
All right, thank you. Senator Chiesa, I mentioned to Senator Chiesa and Senator Heitkamp, I'd like for us to try to limit ourselves to 5 minutes in this round, so it's in your hands, and I'm going to take a quick phone call, and I'll be right back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've talked about how we are continuing to evolve as a law enforcement community and as a legislative community in trying to educate ourselves about human trafficking. Part of that, obviously, is reminding people at every chance we get that we have modern-day slavery, because that's something that shocks people when they hear it, and they hear the statistics, and they hear about the numbers that we have in this country and in other places. So what I would like to talk to each of you about now is one of the issues we try to deal with in New Jersey was when we come on a crime scene, our law enforcement officers are expertly trained to identify it, take it down, and then take steps to prosecute whoever might be involved in that criminal activity. One of the things we started to ask them to do was to dig a little deeper and find what may be not obvious at first glance. I know that you've talked a lot about the sharing of information. Some of the questions went to that. I'd like to know, as a result of the tremendous amount of knowledge that you're beginning to build up, how much of that is shared with state and local law enforcement, and through what methods is it being shared? And I'll start with Judge Hill.
At DHS, one of our primary focuses is state and local law enforcement. So one of the very first products we produced after we had reviewed the academic literature was a computerized training for state and local law enforcement, specifically designed to capture in video segments, for example, a brothel scene or a traffic stop or encountering a young a teenager on the street dressed in a manner and in a place where you might believe prostitution was occurring, to alert the officers to what are the indicators from those scenes that could lead you to believe that trafficking is possibly occurring, and then what should you do based on that. We also have trained them on immigration relief because we know that our foreign-born victims will be interested in immigration relief, and it will help us, as we investigate the case, help stabilize that victim. So we have then worked internationally as well with the capacity building that Mr. Dinkins has referenced. So we go to many, many conferences, including the National Native American Law Enforcement Association. Just there last week in Las Vegas, DHS was represented and presenting. So wherever we can, we try to share our materials and also live programming to raise the level of understanding of trafficking.
Thank you. Mr. Dinkins.
I'll point out a couple different, because I do think this is a key for our successful investigations, is our state and local partners and tribal partners are really the front line in detecting so much of the criminal activity. So we do it both formal training, for example, when they're in their different academies, but also even during roll call in the mornings and the afternoons at the change of shifts, recognizing that not everybody's going to go back through the police academy. So we do it both informally and formally with our state and local law enforcement partners. But also I'll point out another way that we've been able to hit a large number, and that's through associations. For like the ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Investigators, which is for over 15,000 investigators from different financial institutions. We created webinars working with them to actually educate the investigators in the financial industry to identify red flag indicators of human trafficking. So we're doing it on many different fronts, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Gannon?
I agree that the coordination with state and local law enforcement and education and training for them is vital to combat this issue. The Justice Department's Bureau of Justice Assistance and Office for Victims of Crime, which are two grant components, have been very engaged in this issue. They have provided grants to state and local law enforcement task forces, which are in addition to the FBI task forces, to examine comprehensive ways to combat this issue and provide them with the training and best practices. In addition, the Office for Victims of Crime provides training on how to respond to victims of trafficking, which is an integral part to addressing this issue, because a victim who is receiving the services that they need can assist with the prosecution of the offender. And so from July 1st, 2011 to June 30th, 2012, these grantees trained 28,000 or over 28,000 professionals representing schools and educational institutions, faith-based organizations and religious institutions, victim service providers, in addition to state, tribal, and local law enforcement. So we're doing that both through the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office task forces, but also through these grant programs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Senator Heitkamp?
Probably just to talk to you, Ms. Gannon, about the kind of challenges of working with these victims and the difficulty that we have. You know, one of the things that we did in domestic violence is we began to prosecute cases without victim testimony. It was a huge training effort, and it changed the way we looked at these cases. And one thing that the judge mentioned is the difficulty in having traumatized victims provide testimony. If our prosecutions are going to rely on victim testimony, we're not going to be very successful. And so what strategies has DOJ advocated for to get beyond relying on victims and to do investigations and prosecutions that are not victim-centered?
The department, through its Project Safe Childhood coordinators, and each U.S. Attorney's Office also has a civil rights, human trafficking prosecutor coordinator, and they receive training and information via email listservs that provide them the best practices. So an essential part of a successful prosecution is finding the corroborating evidence.
Of the number of prosecutions that you've had under the federal anti-trafficking law, how many of them were done without a victim?
Apologize, Senator, I don't have that information.
It'd be really interesting to find out, because I think that if we're just always going to rely on repairing a victim, you're going to miss the statute, number one. And number two, you may never get victim testimony for a whole lot of reasons that involve, threats against family, threats against them. I mean, live their world, and you know why they aren't cooperating with you all. They've been told since they were this high that you're untrustworthy and that no one cares about them. And only that person who trafficked them cares about them. And so, there's just a whole lot of things that we need to do better. We focused a lot on the sex trade and sex trafficking, but I want to ask you, Ms. Gannon, what industries are particularly vulnerable to human trafficking in the labor side, and what are we doing to address those industries and making the users aware that they may in fact be buying shoes or maybe eating at a restaurant that has a notorious reputation for using human slaves?
If I just may answer your prior question, technology presents some challenges, but it provides a lot of opportunities, and I think that the federal law enforcement community and prosecutors are looking to technology. A question was asked about cell phones. Correctly forensically examining those cell phones that a victim may have to look at text messages corroborating their information.
Or social media.
Social media, culling through all of the information and evidence seized to build a successful prosecution and to support the victim is something that we absolutely look into and are concerned with. In terms of labor trafficking, just last year, there was an executive order addressing the issue of human trafficking in government contracting domestically, and that issue has also been addressed internationally as well. And we are working with the Senior Policy Operating Group, which is a group of many agencies across the government who meet and discuss important issues. And one of them is identifying industries. The Department of Labor is working on this issue and has issued a list of initial industries, and we are looking at that in order to maximize the effectiveness of the federal government's efforts to remove human trafficking from its supply chain.
Just a point here, and how helpful would immigration reform be to dealing with the labor issue on trafficking?
Senator, at this time, I can't comment on that, but would be happy, and the department would be happy to provide you with any technical assistance on pending legislation.
Because it would seem to me that if people knew that there was a path forward for coming out of the shadows, there would be less of this kind of activity.
Well, that is something that we do focus on in terms of the immigration relief that is available through the T and U visa programs that are options for victims of trafficking to obtain status in the country along with continued presence. So education's occurring on that in terms of specific immigration status for trafficking victims.
Senator Heitkamp, the guy sitting next to you over there, John McCain, who's just had to leave us, but John has worked a whole lot on comprehensive immigration reform. And when you asked that question, I thought immediately underlying causes. That could actually help address one of the underlying causes. I thought it was just a great point. Sometimes when we do these hearings, if we have time, I like to ask our witnesses to take maybe half a minute, just no more than half a minute. Just go back, give an opening statement. I'm going to give you a chance to give a closing statement. It's going to be a real short one. And just like one point, maybe just pick one point that you especially want us to remember, to keep in mind, that maybe you said, that others have said, and part of what we're trying to do here is to find how do we better coordinate this effort across government, across our country, but also look for common ground between the statements that you're giving and the testimony you've given. Mr. Campbell, give us one good takeaway, please. And I know there are a lot of them, but give us one.
Yes, certainly. Well, in this forum, I certainly would ask the public that if they suspect...
I don't think your mic's on.
I would ask the public that if they suspect any child sex trafficking or human trafficking or something just doesn't seem right, maybe it's related to forced labor, to please call 1-800-CALL-FBI.
Say that again?
Report that information. It's 1-800-CALL-FBI,
Okay.
or even just call local law enforcement if they have any concerns at all, and somebody can start working on that and perhaps end up rescuing someone.
If you see something, say something. Now we have the number. Thank you. Say it again.
It is 1-800-CALL-FBI.
Thank you. Ms. Gannon?
Thank you. Just like to state that the department is fully committed to this issue. It is one of the Attorney General's priority goal as part of the Vulnerable People Priority Goal. We are committed to investigating this crime, prosecuting the offenders, and providing victims the services that they need.
All right, thanks. Mr. Diggins, just a very short statement, please.
Sir, awareness, 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 and thank you for having this hearing to bring awareness to this issue.
Thank you. And then my thanks to Senator Heitkamp and to Senator Chiesa for making sure I was aware of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you for your leadership of this committee, and thank you for your leadership on the issue of human trafficking. As the chairman said earlier, human trafficking should be called exactly what it is, modern-day slavery. It's a plague on our nation and the world. It is, to put it bluntly, a crime against humanity. It is a crime against the dignity of every person who is victimized by the ruthless criminals who trade in human beings. And it is a crime against society. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it is happening, not just in some foreign lands. It is happening here in our own country. And it's time, indeed it's past time, to put an end to it. We must not be content to just make a dent in human trafficking. We must do everything we can do to eliminate it, to abolish modern-day slavery from our country and from around the world. This is an ambitious goal, but not an impossible dream. We must commit ourselves to ending the nightmare that the millions of victims of human trafficking are living every day. Because none of us would give up our freedom for even a day, all of us must dedicate ourselves to ensuring that no one else suffers that fate. There are more people in slavery around the world today than at any other point in our history. As many as 27 million people around the world are being held in bondage, forced to work in unsafe, degrading, and inhumane conditions. That's the equivalent to 3 times the entire population of New Jersey, or 30 times the entire population of Delaware, and an estimated 100,000 of them are right here in the United States. Deprived of their liberty, subject to unspeakable abuse, the victims of human traffickers cry for help, but too often their cries are unheard. Today in this hearing, we are giving them a voice. We are hearing their pleas for rescue and for freedom. And most important, we are committing ourselves to answering their cries. The war to eradicate human trafficking must be fought on many fronts. It requires the concerted, sustained efforts of law enforcement, federal, state, and local. Intergovernmental cooperation is also essential to success. It requires legislators at every level to provide the resources that law enforcement needs to sustain an effective effort to bring human traffickers to justice. And it's not adequate to provide just enough resources to fund a limited effort. Without dedicated resources, there cannot be a dedicated effort. It requires lawmakers to make changes to the laws that allow human traffickers to sell their victims with impunity. Modern slaves are no longer auctioned in the public square. They are sold on the internet and on the back pages of newspapers. Human traffickers and the publishers who take their advertisements hide under the cloak of the First Amendment, even though the First Amendment was never intended to protect criminal enterprises. Eliminating human trafficking requires the active involvement of concerned citizens working together to raise awareness about this terrible problem and advocate change. Modern-day slavery exists in the shadows, but it leaves clues to its existence that informed citizens can recognize and call attention to. And it requires the close cooperation of federal, state, and local governments. We must work together to uncover the crime where it exists, prosecute the criminals to the fullest extent of the law, and assist the victims so they're not twice victimized, first by their captors, and then by the system that often treats the victims as criminals themselves. As an assistant U.S. attorney and as the Attorney General of New Jersey, I was in a position to ensure that we put in place the dedicated resources to sustain a dedicated effort to combat human trafficking. But I know that the vast majority of law enforcement agencies across the country and at every level find themselves limited in their efforts by the limitations of the resources. To our witnesses today, I ask you to be very candid in your assessment of where we stand in the fight against human trafficking and to tell us exactly what more we need to do to bring about its eradication. We have seen over the years effective short-term efforts to combat human trafficking in places where it seems to grow overnight and disperse just as quickly. International sporting events, such as the Super Bowl, which is being played in New Jersey this February, often attract huge numbers of human traffickers. And in New Jersey, we are seeing a coordinated effort to let human traffickers know that they are not welcome and that if they decide to bring their evil trade to our state, they will pay a heavy price. But as important as such efforts are, they are just part of the solution, and they are temporary in nature. For human traffickers, there is no off-season. And for their victims, there are no bye weeks or timeouts. Their captors exploit them day in and day out for as long as they can. Mr. Chairman, I'm very much looking forward to the testimony of our witnesses today. I want to again thank you for conducting this hearing today.
The importance, more aware of the importance of this. Judge Hill.
Thank you for having us. Most of the federal government's efforts, as well as state efforts, are based on the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. I think this hearing has revealed that there has to be a
Say those again, the 3 Ps, those are good.
prevention, protection of the victim, and prosecution. And this hearing has revealed what others have already said before me. We need to have a 4th P, partnership. That's the way we're going to be able to really fight this and end modern slavery. Thank you.
Those are great closing statements. Thank you all. Again, you're going to be asking additional questions for the record. I would just ask that when you receive those, that you respond to them as promptly and as fully as you can. We're really grateful for your being here and for the work that you do. Thank you so much. Now with that, we'll bring our next panel forward. Thank you. We want to welcome our second panel today, and I'm going to give very brief introductions for each of you. We're happy to see you. Thank you for, how many of you, raise your hand, were you able to be here for part or all of the first panel? Oh, that's great. That's excellent. Well, our first witness today is Mr. John Farmer, Jr., Dean. He became Dean of the Rutgers School of Law in, I'm tempted to say Newark, but we know it's Newark, New Jersey in July. I think, in July of 2009. And April 2013, he was appointed to serve as a senior vice president and general counsel of Rutgers University. Legal career spanned service in high-profile government appointments, private practice, and teaching in law school administration. Mr. Farmer began his career as a law clerk to Associate Justice Alan Handler of the New Jersey Supreme Court. I'm sure that the two of you know each other pretty well, so welcome. Our next witness, and I'm going to probably screw this one up. Suzanne, I'm pretty good on your first name, but it looks like Kaplinger? Kaplinger? Okay, Kaplinger. And Executive Director of the Minnesota Indian Women's Resources Center. Ms. Kaplinger serves on a number of boards, including the American Indian Community Development Corporation, as a consultant for the Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center. She's also one of 15 national leaders selected for the 2011-2012 Move to End Violence initiative hosted by the No Vo Foundation. Welcome, and nice to see you. Next, our third witness is Ms. Lisa Bruner, and Program Specialist for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Ms. Bruner has worked in the domestic violence and sexual assault field for over 15 years and is also Executive Director of a nonprofit organization whose work addresses violence against Native Americans and Alaskan Native women. Ms. Bruner has advocated on the local, state, national, and international levels to raise awareness about the violence against Native women and within tribal communities, something that Senator Heitkamp has discussed with me earlier. Final witness is Mr. Daniel. How do you pronounce your last name?
Papa.
Papa. Oh, okay. Mr. Papa, isn't that a great name? Is a world history and government teacher at Jefferson High School in Jefferson Township, New Jersey. He is the director of Project Stay Gold, a student movement to abolish modern-day slavery. Under Mr. Papa's leadership, his students have recently launched a new campaign called Not on Our Turf to raise awareness of human trafficking surrounding the Super Bowl, which is being held in New Jersey next year. All right, please proceed. Your entire testimonies will be made part of the record. And so, Mr. Farmer, if you want to lead us off, we'll get going. Thank you. And again, I want to especially thank my colleagues, Senator Heitkamp and Senator Chiesa, for their encouragement and recommendation of witnesses for this hearing, which I think has just been very, very helpful, at least to me and I think to a lot of us. Thank you. Mr. Farmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the committee for inviting me here today to speak about human trafficking, one of the most important and significant civil and human rights issues of our time. Human trafficking is an issue that, like terrorism and drug trafficking, challenges both the categories we use to think about crime and ultimately the very structure of law enforcement itself. It is also an issue that, like terrorism and drug trafficking, has touched my career at different times and in different ways. I served as New Jersey Attorney General over a decade ago when the law enforcement community first became aware of what we now call human trafficking on a scale that transcended local, state, and national boundaries. New Jersey conducted one of the first undercover investigations of East European prostitution trafficking to bars and massage parlors, and cooperated in an investigation of sweatshop labor conditions. Through these efforts, we had an early glimpse of the international dimensions of the trafficking issue. It was clear even then that this was an issue that defied ideological categorization, even as it defied geographical boundaries. It is a tribute to our system that the issue has unified politicians as diverse in their orientation as Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who sponsored pioneering federal human trafficking legislation in 2000, and President Obama, who echo each other in recognition of its evils. Last year, Rutgers Law School in Newark, where I was serving as dean, I'm currently on leave from that job as general counsel of the university, hosted a conference on human trafficking. That conference, which we hosted in partnership with the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office and Seton Hall Law School, was the second annual event intended to highlight the most serious criminal law issues of our time. It followed a symposium on cybercrime in 2011. The Human Trafficking Symposium brought home to me how far we've come in combating human trafficking, but also how far we have to go. I'd like to highlight both issues in my testimony this afternoon. First, there's no question that our states, nation, and to a lesser extent the world have come a long way in terms of both awareness and action. In the 1990s, as awareness was beginning to dawn, we were as likely to see the women who were being trafficked as criminals as we were to see them as victims. To a lesser extent, this is still an issue. But in the intervening years, as the magnitude of the problem we face became clear, awareness has also grown, and with it, the tools available to law enforcement to combat the problem have multiplied. A few recent real-world examples should suffice to make the point. Earlier this month, a prostitution ring operating out of Lakewood, New Jersey, was taken down. The women involved, who were all from Mexico, were reportedly promised jobs as house cleaners or babysitters and lured across the border. Prior to the recognition of trafficking as an international law enforcement issue, the problem of prostitution in Lakewood would likely have been seen as an issue strictly for local or county or, at best, state law enforcement. Now, however, law enforcement has become accustomed to going beyond the local manifestations of criminal activity to the underlying and broader issues. The Lakewood ring, for example, is alleged to have been part of a broader ring operating out of New York and other surrounding states with additional ties to Mexico itself. This case follows closely upon the announcement in July 2013 of the arrest of 150 alleged traffickers and the recovery of 105 sexually trafficked children between the ages of 14 and 17 in the largest nationwide crackdown in history. Operation Cross Country took place in 76 cities across the country and involved the cooperative efforts of 4,000 law enforcement officers and literally dozens of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. In my home state of New Jersey, 70 arrests resulted, mostly in the area around Atlantic City. This kind of effort and cooperation was inconceivable back in the days when we didn't recognize the scope of the problem. Such complex investigations reflect more than just growing awareness. They also reflect substantive changes in the law and in the structure of law enforcement. According to the Polaris Project, some 39 states passed anti-trafficking statutes as of August 2013. Under the leadership of Senator Chiesa in his prior role as Attorney General of New Jersey, our state passed a cutting-edge anti-trafficking statute earlier this year that has been highlighted by the Polaris Project as a model for the nation. The New Jersey legislation treats trafficked people as the victims that they are, making it easier for them to expunge convictions, to seek assistance, and to serve as witnesses. It builds on the existing criminal statutes to make it easier to reach trafficking networks. Senator Chiesa also, in his role as Attorney General, created a human trafficking office within the Division of Criminal Justice and issued a statewide law enforcement directive ordering an increase in trafficking investigations and prosecutions, an increase in law enforcement training, and an increase in services available to victims. Trafficking has also been highlighted at the national level by the American Bar Association, which identified human trafficking as its signature issue for 2012, and by the Uniform Laws Commission, which adopted a Uniform Act on Human Trafficking in June 2013. This Uniform Act was approved by the ABA at its annual meeting in San Francisco in August. The adoption of a uniform state law will be a significant step, as it will minimize the potential confusion and disparate treatment of both victims and perpetrators that could arise from differing laws in multiple jurisdictions. We have, in short, come a long way in recognizing the scope of the trafficking problem and in aligning our laws and the structure of law enforcement to meet the threat to human liberty and the insult to human dignity posed by human trafficking. The question then is what remains to be done? What are the short-term threats and the long-term solutions? In the balance of my time, I'd like to highlight a short-term threat and 3 areas in which more progress needs to occur. The highest profile short-term threat and a real test of the new laws and structure of our anti-trafficking efforts will come with the festivities that will envelop New Jersey and New York surrounding the 2014 Super Bowl. Although the numbers are debated, experience has demonstrated that high-profile events like the Super Bowl attract an upsurge in human trafficking incidents. One woman who was enslaved as a child and now works to eradicate child prostitution estimated that she would be expected to have sex with over 20 people per day during Super Bowl week. Considering the most effective ways to prepare for the Super Bowl would be a good way to talk about the next steps in combating trafficking generally. First, although we are on the road to having the right laws is a major achievement, but it will not be sufficient. The devil will be in the details of the enforcement of those laws. Second, because human trafficking is a crime that respects no boundaries, the geographic and bureaucratic boundaries that exist between and among law enforcement agencies themselves must be overcome. This has become, in an age of transborder crimes like terrorism or money laundering or illegal arms smuggling, the most challenging issue for law enforcement. The reality is that our law enforcement structure, with its emphasis on local police departments, augmented by statewide and federal law enforcement, is largely a product of an age when threats were overwhelmingly local and isolated. The frustrations law enforcement experiences, for example, in solving unsolved homicides, is largely a function of the reality that law enforcement is trapped within boundaries that do not constrain criminals. A new kind of structure is required to cope with this reality. I am aware that the effectiveness of fusion centers in fighting terrorism has been controversial in Washington. My own view is that they are absolutely essential to effective law enforcement in a borderless criminal environment. I have visited the centers in New Jersey and in Las Vegas and have spoken with fusion center leaders from around the country. While they are, as a group, perhaps too autonomous, they are, in my view, nonetheless essential, for they bridge a critical gap. In human trafficking, as in other borderless crimes, the scope of the conspiracies may transcend boundaries, but the first evidence of criminal conduct is likely to occur locally. Local reports of suspicious activity reported that fusion centers capable of sifting and collating the intelligence can be essential to identifying and interdicting the potential criminal conduct. Without fusion centers, or something like them, we have no hope of taking advantage of the street-level acumen of the vast majority of law enforcement officers. This brings me to my final point of emphasis, awareness and training. If our local law enforcement officers are not trained adequately, they may not know to report suspicious precursor activity so that the dots can be connected. The Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative undertaken by the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security, which I assisted in developing by conducting roundtables in Denver, Boston, and Chicago, in which precursor conduct and other indicators of criminal activity are identified in training modules designed to guide discretion toward objective factors such as conduct and away from inappropriate indicators such as race, afford a useful template that could, in my opinion, be adapted easily to the human trafficking context. Finally, in my view, the suspicious activity reporting concept must be extended beyond law enforcement to the general public. Hotel workers, for instance, if properly trained to look for the signature conduct of human trafficking, might be in the best position of all to report criminal activity. In New Jersey, training in human trafficking is in fact being extended to the hospitality industries in anticipation of the Super Bowl. This kind of training should occur nationwide, in my view. Human trafficking, like terrorism and the other transborder crimes, challenges us to adapt our laws and our government structures, make our own borders irrelevant. Thanks to the work of Senator Chiesa and others, we have put the right laws in place, and we have begun to raise awareness. A further commitment to fusion centers and to initiatives like suspicious activity reporting will be an important next step, in my opinion, in enabling us to eradicate human trafficking. Thank you again for your invitation.
Mr. Farmer, thank you very, very much. Ms. Kaplinger.
Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Chiesa, Senator Heitkamp, thank you very much. On behalf of the women and children we serve at the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center in Minneapolis, I want to thank you for this opportunity to bring to your attention an egregious human rights violation that is being perpetrated against vulnerable Native American children. Sex trafficking of our children is a growing concern. In 2009, my organization published the first research in the country to analyze the scope of sexual exploitation of any demographic group. Copies are provided to you. The Shattered Hearts report found disturbing patterns of Native women being targeted by traffickers. For example, of women and girls screening into direct service programs during this study, 40% of the women reported some involvement in commercial sexual exploitation, and 27% reported activities that were defined as sex trafficking under the TVPA. Our current program for Native girls is screening for risk factors and involvement. We have found that almost 3/4 of the girls who are coming into our program have experienced long-term homelessness and had a family member diagnosed with mental illness and had experienced either physical or sexual violence. The same percent, 86%, also had a mental health diagnosis themselves, had child protection involvement, and 86% had experienced exposure to the sex trade. That's no coincidence. At the 6-month follow-up, this program is really finding good results. About 3/4 of these girls were now getting housed safely and receiving mental health care themselves. Our program is the only one of its kind that is serving Native girls with a culturally strength-based service. It has a wait list, and we are receiving more recommendations and referrals from law enforcement officials every week. We continue to receive reports that Native girls are being targeted for recruitment by traffickers to the oil fields of North Dakota and are being sold in the man camps. One alleged incident involves a 14-year-old Native girl who was reportedly sold to 40 men in one night. One 15-year-old girl in our program has told us that her brother's best friend has repeatedly tried to get her up to the man camps because, as he told her, "You can make us a lot of money, honey." We also know that boys and GLBTQ, or our two-spirit relatives, are also being perpetrated against, but we don't have any data. We recognize that they are vulnerable, and more research needs to be made into this population. We believe that the data we have is only a snapshot, a small portion of the true numbers being trafficked for a number of reasons. The widespread normalization of sexual violence in American Indian communities has numbed many youth to the point where they minimize and rationalize what is happening to them, just as domestic violence victims do. Some girls are gang raped in by Native mob or other local street gangs and live in fear of the consequences of snitching. Methods of recruitment can involve guerrilla pimping, which is essentially gang rapes and brutal beatings, or finesse pimping, which is much more difficult to detect and interrupt. This is a grooming process and has a manipulative pattern similar to domestic violence perpetration, where the initial relationship is loving but becomes increasingly more controlling until the end result is the girls are caught up in a web of abuse and violence that they can't get out of. Drugs are often used to ensure compliance. Most of these girls have multiple risk factors, such as homelessness, early sexual abuse, and parental addiction or mental illness. Willingness to report or cooperate with law enforcement is rare due to a lack of secure housing and the complex traumas that these children suffer from. As they are reluctant to report to law enforcement, they are not counted in the national data sets as trafficking victims. The current requirement to make a law enforcement report and be certified by law enforcement in order to be counted as a trafficking victim is hindering our ability to get a true snapshot of what the scope of the problem is. The damage to the victims is severe in both human and economic terms. Our 2012 research report, Early Intervention to Avoid Sex Trading and Trafficking of Minnesota's Female Youth, a benefit cost analysis, found the quantifiable damage to a girl recruited into sexual slavery includes traumatic brain injury, damage to reproductive systems, and injuries from violent assaults. Mental health issues such as PTSD and dissociative disorders are common, yet we cannot quantify the damage to a child's spirit, to her self-esteem, to her family, or her community. This analysis shows a definitive return on investment to the taxpayer of Minnesota of $34 for every $1 that is invested in early intervention and prevention services. We now know what works, and we have the evidence to show that it not only saves lives, but saves taxpayer dollars. It's now a matter of prioritization. Since the publication of our Shattered Hearts report, my organization has engaged local community and tribal partners in solutions. For example, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, is working to collect more data and create systemic responses to trafficking. I've conducted multiple trainings across the country, including with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and at the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. Across all systems, there is a need for more awareness of the tactics being used by perpetrators and for technical assistance in identifying and responding to the crime. Again, in North Dakota, tribal sexual assault advocates are telling us of multiple young women who are reportedly being victimized by traffickers but are too terrified to report the crime. The Bakken oil fields are indeed a boom to the economy of the region and have also created an explosive market for sex traffickers who find vulnerable victims among Native American children. This presents an opportunity for the businesses that are profiting there to step into their leadership role. There's a great need for more law enforcement, more victim services, more awareness, more education. I hope that the industry will seize this opportunity to invest in the wellness of the entire community where they now live and work. In Minnesota, our Human Trafficking Task Force has created a strong multidisciplinary response. In 2011, we passed a safe harbor bill, which recognizes juveniles sold into sex as victims of a crime and aligns the state statute with the federal TVPA. Last year, we presented to the state legislature a model services and housing program called No Wrong Door, which is the result of a comprehensive team approach analyzing how we can better identify youth and get them into protective services and healing services rather than the juvenile justice system. We were successful in securing a modest amount of funding to begin that program, but we need additional resources to fully complete the data analysis and the training requirements that are part of the plan. And we are collectively beginning to design more effective approaches to reducing the demand for sexually exploited children, for without the demand, there would be no supply. So again, I want to thank the committee members for their leadership in holding this hearing. No person should be viewed as a commodity. We need more resources, and we need to stop this as a market-driven enterprise and go after the demand where it starts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kaplinger. Ms. Bruner, please proceed.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Thank you for the invitation to be here to the committee members. Thank you to Senator Heitkamp and the office reaching out for that invitation for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center to be here. Human trafficking of Native women in the United States is not a new era of violence against Native women, but rather the continuation of a lengthy historical one, with the colonization of America through wars, forced removal from their homelands to reservations, boarding schools, and forced urban relocation. Domestic human trafficking in the United States has a long-standing history. Native women experience violent victimization at a higher rate than any other U.S. population. Congressional findings are that Native American and Alaska Native women are raped 34.1%. More than 1 in 3 will be raped in their lifetime. 64%, more than 6 in 10, will be physically assaulted. Native women are stalked more than twice the rate of other women. Native women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average of the United States. Non-Indians commit 88% of the violent crimes against Native women. Given the above statistical data and the historical roots of violence against Native women, the level of human trafficking given the sparse data collected can only equate to the current epidemic levels we face within our tribal communities and nations. As an enrolled member of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation in Minnesota, I live, work, and raise my children on my reservation. I have worked for over 15 years addressing domestic violence and sexual assault of Native women, and have witnessed and heard countless stories of human trafficking occurring to the point we have girls as young as 12 years old who are victims. With the introduction of heroin, we now have an epidemic of the same age group, and women who are trafficked now have heroin needles in their arms. Native women and girls are sold for $20 worth of heroin. We have mothers who call local county sheriff's departments reporting their daughters missing only to be told, we have better things to do with our time, or why don't you be a mother and know where the hell your daughter is? It is difficult given the jurisdictional complexities of the 566 federally recognized tribes in the country with non-public law 280, public law 280, 638 contract, land claim settlement states, Oklahoma's checkerboard, and Alaska Native villages. To add to the complexity, if the perpetrator is non-native, then the tribes and Alaskan villages do not have criminal jurisdiction. With the recent wide-range impact of extractive industries such as oil fracking and pipelines, is predatory economics at its worst for the Fort Berthold Nation in North Dakota and Fort Peck reservations in Montana. With the fracking of the Bakken Formation comes man camps. The victim advocates responding to calls for services on Fort Berthold said there has been a doubling and tripling of numbers of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking incidences since 2008. The multiple layers of issues that have come to the forefront are the lack of documentation of these man camps. Emergency services often can't find their locations, and since they are located in isolated and desolate areas, there are often no cell phone services available. There are two types of man camps, documented and undocumented. Undocumented camps are often 50 to 100 trailers that a rancher or farmer has set up on his land to rent out and make money. These undocumented camps present a special problem for emergency services and organizations since they do not exist on a map or have addresses. The other issue involved with the man camp in Fort Berthold is lack of monitoring and registration of sex offenders, whether they are documented or undocumented man camps that pose a serious threat to the safety of women and children in the area. In Montana, the Bakken oil boom has impacted the largest reservation, Fort Peck, and residing counties have experienced both a population and crime explosion. The majority of employees from the oil rigs are not from Fort Peck tribes or Roosevelt County or even from Montana. There have been documented increases in drug use and human trafficking, theft, alcohol-related incidences, and assaults within the last year. Law enforcement response, tribal domestic violence, sexual assault services, and medical responses to these crimes have tripled in the last year. Within northeast Montana, there are currently 3 man camps, with several more only 70 miles away in the neighboring state of North Dakota. Many tribal advocates have responded to victims that have been trafficked at the man camps, often preying on young Native women. Groups of men from the man camps use free access to drugs and alcohol as a method of coercion for young Native women to get in the car and go partying. This has resulted in 11 young Native women ranging from the ages of 16 and 21 years of age reporting rape, gang rape, and other sex acts. The majority of these victims are afraid to report due to fear and shame. The Fort Peck Tribe's SONA program reports that 1 year ago there were 48 registered sex offenders. Now there are over 600 registered sex offenders. The struggle has been that non-native sex offenders do not recognize the tribal jurisdiction and feel they do not have to report to the tribal SONA program. However, the U.S. Marshals and other law enforcement agencies have assisted in gaining registration of known sex offenders on the tribal registry. Another aspect of the domestic human trafficking issues in the United States and tribal nations is the U.S. adoption industry. In an article in Indian Country Today titled, "Trafficking of Native Children," the seamy underbelly of the United States adoption industry brings to light the practice of selling Indian infants and children to the highest bidder, which brings in revenue for lawyers from $25,000 to $100,000 per child. In this article, it is stated that in 2012, 50 Native children were adopted out from North Dakota to South Carolina. These adoptions are done without the tribe's knowledge or consent of that biological fathers. To really gain insight to the domestic human trafficking in the United States, one must take examination of the many sectors in which this is facilitated, whether it be extractive industries, pimps, gangs, cartels, family members, or lawyers working in the adoption industry. Many different avenues must be examined and taken into account to fully understand what leads to this epidemic of human trafficking that not only impacts tribal nations and Alaskan villages, but all citizens of this country. I am a program specialist with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Our role as an organization is to serve as a National Indian Resource Center that provides technical assistance and training, resource development, policy development, research activity, and public awareness that also seeks to enhance Native American and Alaska Native tribes, Hawaiians, or the Native Hawaiians, tribal and Native Hawaiian organizations to respond to the violence against Native women. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for just a terrific testimony. Thank you. Compelling testimony. Mr. Papa, welcome.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the committee for this opportunity to share the great work that my students have done, and I especially would like to thank Senator Chiesa for his commitment to fighting human trafficking and also his support of the modern-day student abolitionist movement. As we gather here today, we've heard the statistics: 27 million slaves on earth, more slaves than ever before, 100,000 people trafficked throughout the United States. In the face of this global crisis, my students have proposed a solution, and I believe that today is also about a day of solutions and a day of collaboration. I believe that the solution to human trafficking, a solution to human trafficking within our country, is inside our classrooms. And I am proud to represent the great work that the students have done in my school. The journey begins when, in October of 2010, I was teaching about the introduction of slavery in America's past. And while teaching that, I made a connection to modern-day slavery. I have observed as a teacher that young people have a sensitivity to injustice. As I have taught issues of injustice in the past throughout history, whether it's been the Holocaust, whether it's been slavery, I've noticed a different level of engagement in the room. Young people have a sensitivity, and that sensitivity to injustice has fueled Project Stay Gold. While I made the connection, I had a student come to me and say, "Mr. Papa, we have to do something about this." With that, we had 35 students sign up, and we organized an awareness campaign inside of our school. With the 35 students, they created a PowerPoint lesson, and they went into the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade social studies classrooms, and they taught a lesson on modern-day slavery and human trafficking. They created posters and put posters around the school. They made announcements on morning announcements. They sold wristbands that say abolitionist on it. The first day that we actually had the wristbands, that we sold 400 wristbands in 24 hours. We had teachers coming up to us from all around the school saying, "What are these posters about? What are these kids talking about? What is this issue?" Our young people were educating the educated. It was an unbelievable experience. The students were so moved by the experience of sharing and exposing this crime. They came to me and they said, "Mr. Papa, we have to do more. What more can we do?" And so with that, we launched the website, projectstaygold.org. We created videos where the students spoke to the issue and they raised awareness. They used statistics and so on that they have learned, and we launched these videos. And through that, the students were invited to many different events. They presented 2 years in a row at National Human Trafficking Awareness Day in Trenton, New Jersey, at our state capitol, and that is where we met Senator Chiesa. The students also presented at the Department of Health and Human Services Awareness Day in New York City. They've presented at colleges, universities, public libraries, churches, and other communities. The students have with the Super Bowl coming to our state, have launched a campaign called Not on Our Turf, Students for a Traffic-Free Super Bowl. They've launched a website, they've created a video, and they've taken to social media as well. Part of their vision is they've also organized a student summit on October 15th at Caldwell College in New Jersey, where they've invited students from all over the state to come learn the issue. Not only learn the issue, but they're going to give students action kits and action packs that they can go back to their school and launch an awareness campaign with the Super Bowl coming to our state. One of our students has initiated a petition on change.org. He initiated it 3 weeks ago, and within 3 weeks, he has 4,000 signatures calling for the NFL host committee, the Super Bowl host committee, to address the issue of human trafficking. And also part of their vision for Not on Our Turf Super Bowl campaign is to create public service announcements that could be on radio and also on cable TV, where they will speak to the issue and raise awareness to the public. I also want to mention that part of what our students are doing is it's not just awareness what they're doing. Educating young people is prevention. And what we have seen is actually our students have gone out into other schools. They've gone to other middle schools and high schools, and they have taught lessons to other schools are now joining in to this effort. And what we have found is that that as young people educate young people, this is a solution. This is a part of a solution. There are three ways that I believe the federal government and state and local governments can partner with schools and with young people. First, as we've mentioned already today, I believe that the federal, state, and local governments could work with the departments of education on bringing more of an awareness, sort of as if the way harassment, intimidation, and bullying education has come into the schools, education regarding human trafficking. I also believe that grants could be offered to student movements who meet certain criteria to bring attention and awareness to this. And I just also believe that government supporting the movements of young people is a very powerful step towards prevention as well. So thank you.
That's pretty amazing work that you're doing there, Mr. Papa.
Thank you.
Thank you. In the first panel that presented, I asked each of the witnesses to talk about underlying causes. And we talk a lot about symptoms, but underlying causes. And I'm going to ask each of you to take a shot at that, and we'll start with you, Mr. Papa. Speak to us about underlying causes and how we might address this huge problem by going after underlying causes. Just be fairly brief, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
My students have identified one underlying cause, and that is the acceptance of pimp culture in America. The idea that a Grammy was awarded to a song called P.I.M.P., Pimp. The fact that MTV has a show called Pimp My Ride. My students have identified a pimp as a modern-day slave owner. And I believe that if we could educate America's youth of what a pimp really is, that could be a #1 step towards prevention.
That's a great point. Thank you. Ms. Bruner. Wait, would you turn on your mic? Thank you.
Thank you. Number one would be the poverty. I mean, human traffickers prey on the vulnerability, and the vulnerability are the poverty. The other is the lack of education, understanding what this is for all involved, whether it be the community members themselves, to victim advocates, to law enforcement, to court personnel, to judges, and to schools, to raise that awareness. The other is drugs and alcohol, because this ties hand in hand with that. In order to entice victims is the use of drugs and alcohol. And the fact that our women are being sold for $20 worth of heroin on our reservation, where others, may be meth, that's significant. So addressing that issue also. The other is there needs to be more training for law enforcement. When we look at our tribal law enforcement, we look at our complexities of our jurisdictions. Listening earlier to DHS's response and to the other lady that was sitting in the seat, they're talking about, special attorneys, and you're talking about federal. Well, when you look at the 566 federally recognized tribes in the country, majority are public law 280, which is not federal jurisdiction. That's state and counties. So their FLETC through DHS had they created a domestic violence in Indian country training program, which is not currently being delivered. Currently, what's being taught at the BIA in Artesia in New Mexico, training our law enforcement, is to do a dual arrest. This was done September 2nd by Sergeant Greenwood at the BIA, that this is what they're doing. They're teaching dual arrest, which is setting us back 20, 30 years. And if this is where the capacity is for the training for law enforcement in order to respond to a massive epidemic, which is 6 in 10 of us is going to be victims of, how are they supposed to be responded and educated on sex trafficking that is going unnoticed? They don't know what to look for. So, and then funding to support victims. There needs to be more help and support. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ms. Kaplan?
I would agree with what's been said, and to carry out a little bit what Mr. Papa said, is the hypersexualization of our culture, which tells young girls that their only value is in their sexuality and how attractive they are. I mean, selling Halloween costumes to 9-year-old girls that make them look, like they shouldn't look. That's one part of it, I think. And I think until there's a real honest dialogue about a culture of impunity, sex trafficking is part of a systemic exploitation of those who have the least power, which tend to be women and children, who are not Caucasian more often than not, although not exclusively. And it has similar dynamics to domestic violence, rape, sexual assault. It is a culture of impunity that has identified largely females as commodities or property. And until we have an honest dialogue about that, I don't think we're going to make any big headway.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Farmer?
I would agree with what Suzanne said, and note that trafficking has many faces and there are many causes. It's a very complex phenomenon, but what they have in common, in my view anyway, is where there's an erosion of sustaining social institutions, whether it be the collapse of the Soviet Union even, that caused a vacuum that the Russian organized crime filled, or the collapse of the family in parts of America where you have teenagers running away from home and being victimized. So in my experience in law enforcement is that crime fills vacuums. And when there's a social vacuum created of whatever kind, crime is going to fill it. And in this context, it's filling it with our most vulnerable people.
Okay, thank you. My next question goes back to actually a word, one of the words that was used by, I think, our judge a little bit earlier, and maybe a word that's been used by one of our witnesses here. Remember the judge mentioned, I think it was the judge, she said there are 3 Ps she went through, and then I think she mentioned a 4th one, partnership. I believe it was the judge who said that. And I heard the word collaboration, and I think, was that you, Ms. Bruner? Collaboration. I like, when I ever run into people who've been married a long time, I ask them what's the secret for being married a long time, 40, 50, 60 years. And the best answer I've ever gotten is the 2 Cs, communicate and compromise. And that's also the secret for a vibrant democracy, communicate and compromise. I think if we're going to be successful here on this front, there's got to be a 3rd C, and that C would be collaboration. Collaboration. And as I said earlier, when Senator McCain was, after Senator McCain had spoken and asked a question or two, I mentioned this is an all-hands-on-deck time, and that there's a shared partnership, there's shared responsibility. And let me ask you to focus on the federal piece of that, our role in this collaboration, our role in this partnership. And just very briefly, and I'm going to yield to my colleagues. Mr. Farmer.
Well, I agree with the witness in the first panel who indicated that the federal cooperation has been better in this context than in some others. But there is, and I've been a federal prosecutor and I've been on state law enforcement also, and there is a tendency among federal law enforcement to overlook the value of state and local law enforcement, and to view themselves as sort of the be-all and the end-all. And I think that's improved since I was in office. 9/11 helped improve that, but it's still there. And really the intelligence on the ground is so important, especially in contexts like human trafficking. Entities like fusion centers, I think, can play a vital role in bridging the gap that exists between federal and state and local.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Kaplan, and I'd ask you to be brief, if you would, please.
I think one of the key things is that the federal law is really framed as a law enforcement problem. This is a human rights problem, and we really need to understand the role of the advocates and the NGOs on the ground who are serving the victims and how they can be helpful and how their work can help identify more victims and serve more victims. The data sets will never be complete if we don't allow the frontline advocates to determine who is a victim of human trafficking.
Thank you. Ms. Bruner.
Real quick would be, I would like to see the development of a human trafficking Indian country task force that is inclusive of all federal, state, local, but also the NGOs and the advocates that are on the ground. Often we have a lot of federal people with good intentions but have no understanding of what we deal with in Indian country. They speak very little to that, so if we could have a little bit more dialogue with that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Papa.
If the average age of entry into human trafficking in the United States is the ages of 12 to 14, what better advocates are there than their peers who are middle school and high school age? So I think that if the federal government was able to support through the Department of Education a nationwide educational program brought to the school system, that would be an excellent step.
Senator Heitkamp, that reminds me of that Truth Campaign, doesn't it? Just a little bit of that Truth Campaign on the American Legacy Foundation, which you helped create, was all about. All right. Senator Chiesa, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And this will probably be the last round of questions, but if you will. We'll go at least 7 minutes.
Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks for sharing your expertise, but most importantly, thanks for sharing your passion on this issue. All of you have spoken with great passion about it because you've seen yourselves the impact it has on the people that are devastated by it. So thank you. I do want to thank in particular my friends from New Jersey, Dean Farmer, who has distinguished himself at every level of public service in New Jersey, as a line prosecutor, as the Attorney General, as a senior aide to the governor, and now as the Dean of our law school, jumping in to help Rutgers when they asked him to go over and be their in-house lawyers. They get through some struggles there. So thank you for being here. And Mr. Papa, who I've now known for a little less than 2 years, but whose students are really had a big impact on me. I'd done cases and I talked about it, but I watched young students talk about the issue of human trafficking with such passion and such creativity. I thought it was, it really moved me and it really helped focus me on the importance of spending my time and my energy as Attorney General and doing everything I could to combat it, so thank you. Dean, you talked earlier about the SARs and the role they can play. Can you talk a little bit about how I know you talked in panels that you sat on and things that you'd done, and maybe in an academic setting, but talk about the role they played when you were, when I think of those as in financial crimes in that context. So talk about a little bit about how you've seen in your own mind, how that's evolved into a tool that we should be using in this area of human trafficking.
Well, the thinking behind suspicious activity reporting is that you do, to some extent, academic studies of criminal conduct. And you, from those studies, you extract objective factors that people can look for to identify precursor conduct that leads to crime. And then the object is to train people so that they can spot those indicators, notify law enforcement, or notify the federal law enforcement, or state or local, whatever the appropriate level is. And at that point, it gets filtered up to the fusion centers, and it gets proliferated through the government. And it's a way to bridge the gap between the different levels of government. And what it provides is a template that can be exported from the context of terrorism to other contexts. And there's no more important one that it can be exported to, really, than human trafficking.
And you talked a little bit about making sure that our boots on the ground, the people you described as having the best instincts to recognize these cases. And one of the things that we talked about in New Jersey was to better prepare our law enforcement personnel. They have great instincts. They have great commitment. What I thought I hadn't done a good enough job on was explaining to them that it's okay to take a longer look. It's okay to drill down a little bit further. Can you tell us your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a worthwhile way for our law enforcement community to be trying to eradicate this crime?
No, absolutely. And you know, the tremendous pressure on local law enforcement is to solve the crime that exists today. And that discourages the longer look. And so raising awareness that there is a longer look to take, I think, is critical in dealing with state and local law enforcement. So once they know there's a bigger problem, as we found with with what turned into the undercover investigation of the East European trafficking in bars and massage parlors, it started as just a prostitution case, and then it grew. And we realized it was a much bigger problem. And once they're alerted to that, better investigations will follow.
Thank you. As the son of a retired school teacher, Mr. Papa, I can't say that doesn't influence my respect and my admiration for all that you're doing. When I've had 4 or 5 chances to sit face to face with your students and talk about this issue, and their level of comprehension astounds me. Can you tell us, you talked about some of the cultural things that you're seeing. Talk to us very candidly about the way those things are talked about in your classroom, not just by the leaders who are involved in the programs that you're pursuing that are so terrific, but maybe some of the kids who would be more apt to find themselves in this situation because they don't have either a familial support network or they don't feel part of a group at this school. You hear these conversations every day, whether it's in the hallways or in the classrooms. Talk a little bit more about that and how you think that is a sign that we've become desensitized to the things that can lead us to the spot we find where people are enslaved.
I'll never forget my second year teaching. I had a girl come in to the classroom, and she had a shiner. She had a black eye. You know, we obviously took the proper steps and called DIFAS and so on. A few weeks later, I noticed she wasn't in my classroom. She wasn't there for a few days. A few days turned into a week or two. And I asked one of her friends where she was, and she told me that she ran away because she couldn't take her dad hitting her any longer. And she was in 8th grade, and she ran away to Pennsylvania. So I think that, you know, it's systemic in every, I think, school throughout the country. And I think the one thing that I have seen, though, is I have seen the ability for young people to reach out to other young people within schools who are hurting like a girl like that.
And that's the thing I'd like you to give us a little bit more information on. Your students are now going out to other schools and educating other students.
Right.
And I think that's a great thing to be doing. Can you tell us about some of the reactions you're having from both the students and the teachers at the other schools that you're going to when you talk about human trafficking?
Well, I don't know if this is surprising or not, but from teachers, there's a lot of skepticism. And there seems that students are coming back and they're saying, even students who are wearing the wristband, they've initiated conversations with parents or family members, and parents or family members say, what are you talking about? This doesn't exist. This isn't true. So it seems as if the students are really on the front lines of even trying to convince adult communities. As Mr. Farmer mentioned, when we did an awareness night at our school back in January, we had 2 police officers from our town come, and afterwards they came up to us and they said, we had no idea that this even existed. We didn't know anything about this until we came here tonight. So I think the reaction is pretty shocking. And the main reaction, though, which is the reaction of success, is the ability for a young person to communicate to another young person. And I think, the most important step in education is not what we learn, but it's what we do with what we learn. And if our young people are able to educate their peers and teach them that it's not enough just to know, but it's more than that. It's about doing something with what you know, starting a campaign, starting a Twitter account, starting a Facebook account, and really getting the word out. I think that's the biggest key.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Senator Heitkamp.
You all are just excellent, and you've just done such great work in this area, and you really have put a human face on this problem. I mean, I think the last panel was all about kind of the bureaucratic response, assuming everyone knew. But you're at that level where you're dealing every day with victims, and you're dealing every day with this problem and looking at it from a systemic, long-term view, because this isn't going to change overnight. This is a problem that's been with us since the beginning of humanity, and it is something that I think we thought we eradicated, kind of like eradicating smallpox or polio, and then all of a sudden it comes back because we lose focus and we lose attention, and we think it's okay because it's not us, because it's their kids, not our kids, because it's those people and not all of us. And so we're all in this together, and I just, from every one of you, I just feel a lot more optimistic than I did before I got here, knowing that you're out there thinking about it, thinking about infusion centers and how you're going to look at jurisdictional challenges, thinking about how you're going to educate kids and not let them be victims, and then thinking about the special needs of very, very, very vulnerable populations. And Dean Farmer, if you think jurisdiction's complicated between you and New York City, you try and figure it out in Indian country in a large land-based Indian center. I want to raise another symptom of this problem, and another, especially in Indian country, and I would like both of you to respond to an observation that I have, which is as we look at the high rate of suicide, young teenage suicide on the reservations and really off the reservations within our Native people population, how much of that do you think is related to abuse, neglect, trafficking?
Well, I don't have any good data, but I think that there's a very strong correlation. We see extraordinarily high rates of child abuse in many of our families. That historic trauma, multi-generational trauma that so many families experience has not really been unpacked. And until we understand how to heal whole families, we're going to continue to struggle with this. I think the suicide rate is absolutely linked with alcohol and drug addiction and mental illness. And those, in many cases, are an offshoot of early sexual trauma that has not been dealt with, and the child hasn't had a chance to heal. So I think there's a strong correlation.
I agree with Susan. I would say a majority of the suicides of our children is due to violence, due to child abuse, due to the drugs and alcohol. Just last year, we had a 14-year-old girl hang herself because she was raped. A month later, we had another 14-year-old hang himself with a shoestring on a bathroom doorknob. And then the following month, we had a 19-year-old girl found hanging in 3 days from a tree who was 12 weeks pregnant. The level of suicide is
epidemic.
It's just, at epidemic levels, and we really do need to look at the level of the violence that's being perpetuated in which our children are trying to navigate. And get the help.
If we could give the United States government effort a grade in this area, I guess my question is, what grade would you give us? And I'll start with you, Dean Farmer.
I can just start with the teacher at the other end.
No, he's used to this.
Well, I'm an easy grader. I would say a B+. I think the level of awareness has risen, the effort is there, the coordination could be better.
So is this a grade on its work in Indian country or on
Well,
human
both.
trafficking?
Why don't, I mean,
C-, maybe. I mean, I'm encouraged, I'm seeing progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly with
and
Native
just for maybe some of the folks who aren't as familiar with Indian jurisdiction, the federal government has a unique relationship, whether it's a trust and treaty relationship or whether it is primacy in jurisdiction. And you both raised the specter of the problems that we have right now in Fort Berthold. We could use 5 FBI agents in Fort Berthold right now. We have 3,000 pending criminal cases in tribal court. A vast majority of those cases are drug-related, but we know we've got these ongoing problems. So just so that we know that what we're grading here is a different jurisdictional challenge. Lisa?
I would have to say on a national level, a C, just because it wasn't only a few years ago that Susan and I, with her invitation, were at HHS talking with their human trafficking division, where the funding that was available was not available to address domestic, it was only international. So to see the change occurring is good. For Indian country, I give it a D, just simply because of the jurisdictional issues, the lack of funding coming into Indian country, the lack of education and awareness and training for law enforcement, and building those collaborative relationships that are necessary between tribal, state, and federal agencies to have a united front to address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Papa?
From my perspective, I would say a B. I think that even what we're doing here today, the fact that President Obama has made speeches about it, and and so on, there's been such a greater attention brought, as I have seen, even over the last 3 years from the federal government as I followed it. However, I really believe very strongly that there needs to be far more outreach into the school systems in order to prevent and educate young people of the risk factors and the warning signs, especially from departments of ed, federal and state level as well.
And I just have a few minutes, and I just want to make a comment about victimization and about the work that we've done over the years dealing with victims. It's not easy for victims to come forward. It's not easy for victims to talk about their victimization. It's not easy because there's a lot of shame, especially in Indian country with young girls who may have used drugs and alcohol and ended up in a very bad situation. And so we need to be more concerned about how we deal with victims so that they know that there is justice for them, regardless of what their behaviors were. And I think there's a lot of blaming that goes on, and we need to step back and spend some time talking about how we're going to deal with this problem from a holistic standpoint. And I just thank you all for putting a very human face on this and some great expertise. I think you gave us some great ideas.
Amen. Senator Heitkamp just mentioned to Senator Chiesa, the two of you came up with this idea, and I really didn't know fully what to expect. This has been a terrific hearing. For great witnesses, I thank you both for recommending several people to testify, and for really providing leadership. Although you're both fairly junior in the U.S. Senate, really providing great leadership on this point. I've said to Senator Chiesa, in the first panel, we gave the first panel a chance to make a brief closing statement. I'm going to ask Senator Chiesa to make a very brief closing statement. I'm going to ask you if you would make just a very brief closing statement after Jeff, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to believe that we're talking about people as property in 2013, but we are. But I think it's encouraging that thanks to the chairman's leadership and people like Senator Heitkamp were able to talk about it at the highest levels of government so that we bring attention to it in our schools, in our communities, everywhere that we can. So I really appreciate the passion that all of you brought to this issue today. I really appreciate the chance, Mr. Chairman, to talk about this issue today. And I hope that we'll continue to talk about it and that everybody who's sitting in our chairs will continue to listen so that we can make sure that people understand it's out there and that we're using every resource we can and considering every community. I come from a prosecutor's mentality because that's where I worked, from a victim's perspective as well. All of these perspectives are really important so that we get to a solution that addresses all of it, eradicating it, deterring it, and returning some quality of life to the victims. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Heitkamp.
I'm reminded of a story of a gentleman that I used to work with in North Dakota. He was ran the juvenile justice system in North Dakota, and he did a series of meetings across the state. And everywhere he went, he got a lot of suggestions, and a lot of times he was told what he couldn't do. And they would say, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. And at the end of one of these meetings, an older lady came up to him, an elder, actually it was on the reservation, and she said, you know, Mr. Lick, what you can't do? And he thought, one more. And she said, you can't give up. And we cannot give up on these victims. We're better than that as a country. We're better than that as a people. We're better than that in our humanity. And we will lose ground if we lose focus. And so human slavery has never been okay. It won't be okay on our watch. And so I want to thank the great senator from New Jersey and the senator from Delaware for their allowing me to be part of this important hearing. And thank you all again for putting very human face on this problem.
Well, again, I want to thank our witnesses, just a wonderful panel. And thank you for your heart, and thank you for your conviction, and for your steadfast determination to make sure that we don't ignore these problems, that we say something constructive and keep saying it until we deal even more effectively with this problem. Special thanks to Senators Heitkamp and Chiesa. We wouldn't be here but for your encouragement. But last, my colleagues know, every Wednesday there's a prayer breakfast. Senators, imagine this. Democrat and Republican senators gather at a prayer breakfast. We read the scripture together. We pray together. We even sing a hymn every now and then. I usually don't get to go because they do it fairly early on Wednesday mornings, and I'm usually on a train trying to get here. But they asked me to speak last Wednesday, and one of the things I mentioned was how should our faith guide us in what we do. And Golden Rule just rings loud and clear here for me. It probably does for you as well. The other thing I mentioned was what is the role of government? Whatever the problem or issue that we're facing, what is the role of government? And I oftentimes rely on the words of Abraham Lincoln, who said a lot of memorable things, but he used to say the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. There's a role here for the federal government, and there may be well be a role for this committee. It's Homeland Security and government affairs. Long before it was Homeland Security, it was government affairs. And we have broad investigative powers into the whole range of the federal government. And we use those not just to, on a gotcha kind of mode, but in a way to see how can we foster collaboration, how can we foster greater partnership, how can we realize what is the role of government, not just federal, not just state, not just local, not just law enforcement, not just nonprofits, the faith community. What is the role of all the families, our families? This is a shared responsibility, and this is an all-hands-on deck moment. And I'm encouraged that, having certainly reminded us that we got a problem here, to also realize there are a lot of things that are working that we ought to be doing more of, and I'm encouraged that we just might do that. All right. With that having been said, again, Senator Chiesa, Senator Heitkamp, to all of our witnesses, thank you so much. And thank you. Thank you. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days. That's until October the 8th, my sister's birthday, at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you so much.